Chapter 18. The wading pool had been filled with fresh water, and by the looks of the muddy sand around the base of the blue and green molded plastic, there had been a great deal of recent activity. There were several yellow rubber ducks gliding on the water's surface, scooted along by the occasional gust of hot wind whipping down the mountains. Throughout the hours of boiling sun, swarming flies, colicky horses, and trainers who questioned and cursed Jake over every decision he made, Leah had found her mind drifting to days long past when she and Johnny would sneak away into the mountains to swim in the cold water of crystal-clear streams, then lie like basking seals on massive boulders, naked, counting hawks and eagles that soared high overhead. Back then, their only worry in life had been over their being discovered together. Not that she really cared much. But Johnny did, not for himself, but for his father. With the windows rolled down on the truck and sweat inching down her sides under her manure and blood-stained clothes, Leah stared vacantly through the bug-spotted windshield at the ducks that, scooted by the wind, bumped and nudged one another, and she thought how nice it would be to take Val to those streams, to see the pleasure on his face as the brisk water rushed around his tight legs, and trout, easily seen through the clear as glass water, swam round and round his ankles before nibbling at his toes. But those places were for children who could walk, who could pull themselves up over ledges that were little more than footholds for birds. As the engine shuddered and died, she blinked salty sweat from her eyes and glanced down at the clock. 7:30, she read aloud, then tapped the plastic over the clock face, certain there must be some mistake. For the last week she had not left the track before 10 at the earliest. Yet the sun just creeping behind the western horizon was proof enough that she was, indeed, home. It was daylight, for a while anyway. She would get to see her son awake for a change. Perhaps he could even entice her to run down to the local Dairy Duchess for a hot fudge sundae, his favorite, topped with 2 fat cherries. She stepped from the truck to be greeted by the pygmy goats, grabbing her jeans and tugging for attention. She scratched them between the horns and allowed them to give her a wet kiss on the cheek before heading for the kitchen screen door. Only then did she discover the collection of cars and trucks parked on the north side of the barn, out of the sun. One of them Johnny's truck, she noted with a flutter of excitement in her stomach. A Weber barbecue grill sat beside the steps, coals glowing hot and the smell of cooking grease making her stomach growl. When had she last eaten anything that had not come out of a vending machine in the jockey's lounge? A shout of masculine voices erupted through the door, stopping Leah short. There were whoops followed by, "Kick his ass." "Oh man, that kinda play should be illegal. You guys get ready to pay up. Yo, money is history. Damn game isn't over till the fat lady sings, you bald-headed bastard. Gonzalez is gonna knock that ball into the next county." Leah eased open the screen door. The kitchen table was crowded with platters of crispy hamburger patties, blackened wieners, bowls of chips and tubs of dips. A washtub full of ice and stuffed with beer, wine coolers, and a sweating bottle of Chardonnay sat on the floor near a pile of wet towels and muddy rubber flip-flops. Shirtless and barefoot, Johnny walked into the kitchen, a ketchup-stained dish towel thrown over his shoulder, a hot dog oozing mustard and relish in one hand. His eyes widened when he saw her, and he gave her a lazy smile. "Want a beer? Never mind. You like strawberry wine coolers, as I recall." He reached into the tub and withdrew an icy cooler, tossed it to her, then grabbed up a Budweiser and pointed toward the living room. "We're watching the game." "We?" "Me and the guys." "The guys?" "Edwin. Bobby, Roy. Oh, and Sam Clark." "Sam?" "He dropped by to say hello. So I invited him to stay. It's Friday and he didn't have anything else to do." Leah allowed the screen door to close behind her, allowing Johnny a good look at her at last. His eyes narrowed and the amusement that had twinkled in his eyes became serious. "Looks like you had a rough day, baby." "Not the best. Jake thought I'd had enough and sent me home early," she grinned. "Wanna tell me what's going on? Where is Shamika?" "I gave her the night off. She said something about Mojo's truck stop and kicking up her heels." "And Val?" He grinned again and crooked his finger at her. Leah moved to the living room door. Ed, Roy, Sam, and Robert Anderson were huddled around the television. Situated among them in his wheelchair, smiling, was her son, hair still wet from his pool time, shirtless like the rest of the gang, his face and shoulders red from the sun. The men shouted again, their enthusiasm punctuated by Val yelling, "Kick his ass." Edwin extended his flattened hand to Val. "My man, give me 5. Val struggled hard, then slapped Edwin's hand. The image brought moisture to Leah's eyes. Laying both hands on Leah's shoulders, Johnny directed her toward her bedroom. "Where am I going?" She laughed with a lightness that made her feel giddy. "To sit in a hot bath with lots of bubbles, drink your cooler, maybe listen to a little Neil Diamond, and when you've relaxed thoroughly, you can join us." He escorted her to the bathroom, where a full tub of steaming honeysuckle-scented water awaited her. He kicked the door shut behind them, turned her around to face him, and began to unbutton her blouse. "I called the track and talked to Jake. He said you were headed home and that you were exhausted. That's putting it mildly." Leah closed her eyes, enjoying the feel of Johnny's hands working the tiny buttons of her blouse. His knuckles brushed her breasts, then his fingertips. He unbuttoned and unzipped her jeans, allowing them to fall open while he eased the blouse off her shoulders and let it drift to the floor. As Johnny sat her down on the closed toilet seat and proceeded to remove her boots, Leah twisted the cap off the cooler, somewhat bemused that she was sitting on a toilet, half-dressed, drinking a warmish wine cooler in front of Johnny Whitehorse. "I wonder what your legion of adoring fans would think if they saw you now," she said, then took a swig of the drink. "I'm not the one sitting on a toilet in my bra and drinking wine coolers," he retorted, flashing her a smile. "Hell, they've seen more of me exposed than my chest." "Oh yeah. That NYPD Blue show you did, showing your naked butt off to the entire country. As I recall, it was the highest-rated show of the season." She sipped again and rested back against the tank as Johnny slid the jeans down her legs and tossed them the way of her blouse, boots, and socks. "When I watched the show I thought, aha, they've used makeup on his butt. I happen to know you have a birthmark on your right cheek. As I recall, it looks like rabbit ears. Wonder what the Globe would pay for that juicy bit of information?" He tweaked her nose, then reached for the bra hook between her breasts. "Not much, I think, unless you suggest to them that an alien bit me." The bra fell away from her breasts, and Johnny's eyes turned smoky. "I remember the first time you actually allowed me to touch your breasts. You were so shy. And when I kissed them you would turn your face away and close your eyes." His fingers slid under the elastic of her panties and eased them down her hips to her knees and then her ankles. "We've both grown up a lot," she replied softly. "Learned a lot, have you?" He lowered his head and gently eased his lips and teeth over the tip of her nipple. The touch of his tongue sluiced like hot honey to the juncture of her thighs. Reaching for his hand, she slid it between her legs, groaning at the luscious intrusion of his fingers. Then he pulled away, his flesh moist from the steam that was fast turning the room hazy and hot. "Don't tempt me, Leah. This house is too damn small for us to get too carried away." The guys like their sports, but given the opportunity to listen to a lot of fast breathing and moans of ecstasy, they would choose the ecstasy part every time. "Get in the tub and soak for a while. If you need someone to wash your back, let me know." Standing, he turned for the door, hesitating as he took a couple of long breaths, the obvious ridge in his jeans making Leah giggle like a naughty schoolgirl. The water felt unbearably hot at first, and she eased into it cautiously, allowing her skin to become accustomed to the silken heat before sinking up to her armpits in it. She didn't bother with Neil Diamond. The masculine sounds coming from the other room were music enough to her ears, especially those of her son. Laughing, talking, being treated like any normal boy of 7 years. The all-too-familiar lump rose to her throat, and Leah turned the cooler up to her lips and drank deeply, the instant lethargy it produced making her sink into the mounds of white bubbles and lay her head back against the tub. She thought of Shamika out at Mojo's truck stop, laughing and dancing with lonely truckers, listening to their sob stories of frigid wives and empty marriages, all ploys to entice her back to their cubbyhole cots for hire. She would not go, of course. Shamika enjoyed the laughs and an occasional free meal, but that was as far as it went. She was so level-headed and dedicated to Val that she often made Leah feel guilty for devoting so much time to her job. Then Shamika would remind her that Leah had little choice. While the annuity check she received from the lawsuit was enough to pay for Val's medications, Tegretol for his seizures and baclofen for his muscle stiffness, there were the costs for therapy and the scores of specialists who poked and prodded at Val in hopes of somehow helping his situation. Then there were the extras, AFO boots that cost $700. Wheelchairs that ran $4,000, unless she decided on the electric one, which would run her an easy $10,000. Occasionally the annuity simply would not stretch far enough to pay Shamika's salary, any unexpected doctor visits, or food, clothing, and lodging. Leah closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she found Johnny looking down at her, his dark eyes soft, his lips curved ever so slightly. "Water's cold," he said gently, reaching for the towel and offering her one hand. "The guys are gone. I read Val a story and put him to bed. If you don't get out of there soon, there won't be anything left of you to make love to." Blinking the sleep from her eyes, Leah glanced at her water-wrinkled hands. God, how long had she dozed? The water felt uncomfortably chilly, the bubbles all gone flat. Its label partially off and disintegrating, the wine cooler bottle floated on its side, resembling debris from a sinking ship. Johnny eased the towel around her as she stepped from the tub, then swept her up in his arms and carried her to the semi-dark bedroom lit only by the light of the bathroom behind them, to the bed where he had already turned back the blanket and sheets and fluffed the pillows. She sank with a sigh onto the mattress, her eyes drifting closed with pleasure as he gently dried her body, then tossed the damp towel on the floor. He unzipped his jeans and eased them down his hips. Leah gave him a sleepy smile. "Where's your underwear, Mr. Whitehorse? I don't usually wear them. Remember?" Kicking the jeans aside, he eased onto the bed, sliding one knee between her thighs, rolling her to her side, her stomach against his, her breasts against him, his hard arms holding her fiercely as he whispered in her ear, "I love you." "Is that the Budweiser talking, or you?" She laughed, feeling ridiculously breathless. She wasn't a kid anymore, she reminded herself, yet the expansion in her chest felt no less thrilling than it had the first time he murmured those words in her ear. Both. He nuzzled her ear, teased it with his tongue, lightly nipped it with his teeth. "I'm drunk and crazy as hell about you. You always get a little loose-tongued when you've had too much," she teased, wrapping her leg over his hip and drawing him closer, so close that his penis felt like an iron rod against her belly, hard and hot, a throbbing velvet-skinned erection that made her ache unbearably. "Would you like to see just how loose my tongue can get?" Grinning wickedly, he squeezed her buttocks, then slid his hand between her legs, cupping her mons, easing his long fingers between the folds of her flesh, making her groan and arch against him. Sliding down her body, he lifted her knees over his shoulders, surprising her at first, then rousing in her a shameless pleasure that made her bite her lip to keep from crying out as the first flick of his tongue inside her streaked like jagged lightning down her legs. Her hands flailed, twisted into the sheets, then grabbed the headboard, her body arched into him, his hands slid up her body to caress her breasts as his mouth moved on her, tongue swirling, diving, dipping, teasing until she felt mindless and a scream clawed at her throat that she feared would explode at any moment. She writhed, twisted. His body sweating, he fought his need to drive himself into her, deep into her. He'd been too caught up in his grief and anger those nights before to enjoy what once, so many years ago, had brought him such emotional and physical pleasure. The taste of her in his mouth sluiced through his raw senses like a sweet, floral fire, and he was caught between his need to make slow, passionate love to her and his raging lust to fuck her harder and faster than she had ever been fucked. To show her that he wasn't a timid boy anymore, too afraid of hurting her to really enjoy her. As the first quivering of climax made her grasp his shoulders, her nails digging into his skin, Johnny pulled back, leaving her gasping, her teeth clenched, her body hurting with the desperate need for him to finish pleasing her. He considered taking his time, drawing out the pleasure. To hell with that, he murmured, then slid his body up hers, sliding inside her, to a place once dark that erupted suddenly like bright colorful Roman candles. The midnight wind whipped the window curtains back and spilled over Leah's and Johnny's damp bodies as they lay with arms and legs tangled, her head resting on his chest, his heart a racing murmur against her ear. Her eyes closed, Leah nuzzled him with her cheek. I think every woman alive, at one point in her life, dreams of reuniting with her first love, hoping to capture the magic again that once swept her away, wondering if the reality could ever live up to the memory. He hugged her close, but said nothing. I'm happy to say you more than lived up to the memory. Raising her head, her lips smiling, she said, Hey, do you realize this is actually the first time we've made love and didn't worry about getting caught? Unless, of course, there is a photographer from the Inquirer hidden under the bed. I wonder what's worse, my father or the paparazzi. Still, he did not reply, just stared at the ceiling, his body relaxed, his hand stroking her back absently. Finally, he looked down at her. I want to marry you, Leah. A look of surprise crossed her face, but she did not look away, as she might have many years ago, when even his slightest compliment unnerved her. Is that a proposal? You and Val and Shamika should move in with me immediately. That way my people can control the situation, the fans, the media, etc. I'll have my agents handle all the arrangements for the marriage. It'll have to be done quietly. I don't want a circus, not so soon after Dolores's death. We'll fly my plane to Las Vegas and get married there. Later, if you want, we'll have a formal ceremony with your friends and family in attendance. You're serious? I don't intend to lose you, Leah. You're not going to lose me, Johnny. Gently taking her face between his hands, he looked into her eyes that reflected the moonlight spilling through the window. That's what you promised me last time, just before you told me to get lost. I don't intend to let that happen again, Leah. I won't let you walk away from me again. Word arrived at the Inn of the Mountain Gods, where Johnny's agents and attorney had been staying during their sojourn to Ruidoso, to meet Johnny at 10 sharp at White Horse Ranch. Always punctual, Edwin Fullerman arrived 10 minutes early, looking sharp in his Armani suit, constantly checking his watch as he paced the foyer, mind worrying over the phone conferences he had been forced to postpone due to the impromptu get-together. Jack Hall pulled up 5 minutes later, his face concerned as he mounted the steps and waved a copy of the Inquirer under Ed's nose. Read it and weep, Fullerman. If this is true, our client is up, you know what creek without a paddle. Ed focused on the headline. Johnny Whitehorse coke addict DA offers ultimatum, admit himself to Betty Ford or go straight to prison. Rolling his eyes and groaning, Ed shook his head. I'm not finished, Jack announced, and unrolled another tabloid showing a blurry photograph of Johnny holding Leah Starr on the dance floor at Randy's Bar and Grill. New love drives Whitehorse fiancé to fiery death. Rainwater was heard to cry only moments before tragic ADDIDENT. I'd rather die than lose him to another woman. What a lot of hooey. Edwin slapped the tabloid aside. Yeah. Then how about this one? Jack held up the Washington Post and recited, will scandal foil Foster's plans for re-election? It will if Johnny Whitehorse has anything to say about it. Seems there is a leak in the DA's office. Word is out that Johnny has proof of Foster's involvement with Formation Media. Ed adjusted his glasses and took the Post from Johnny's PR manager. He scanned the article. Had proof. We all know that whatever proof Dolores dug up about Foster burned up in that crash, along with Dolores. Robert Anderson arrived. Joining Edwin and Jack, he slapped them both on the back and smiled. Good news. I just got a call from the assistant DA. Ted Weir informs me that Johnny's blood tests just came back. No trace of drugs, and his alcohol level was well below limit. Great, Edwin groaned. Now the only thing they can charge him with is manslaughter due to reckless driving. Fullerman, you're such a pessimist. Easy for you to say. If Johnny gets charges slapped against him, you double your fees and spend the next year charging him $1,000 an hour to defend him. What the hell do we get? He looked pointedly at Anderson. A big fat zero, because no producer or director or advertising firm will touch him with a 10-foot pole until he wins his case. I'm glad to know you have my best interests at heart, Fullerman. Johnny stepped out of the library, a cup of hot coffee in one hand, a copy of the Washington Post in the other. Edwin shrugged and spread his arms. You know I love you, Johnny, but let's face it. You're worth $1 million a year to me. Johnny stepped aside as the men filed by him into the library, where a table with coffee, juice, and danishes awaited. Edwin made for the refreshments immediately, loading his coffee with 3 spoons of sugar, while Jack grabbed up 2 sweet rolls and headed for a chair near the window. Anderson walked directly to a chair and sat down, placing his briefcase by his feet, his shrewd eyes watching Johnny as Johnny closed the library door, then headed for a chair next to his. His mouth partially full of raspberry Danish, Edwin said, "Want to tell us now why you dragged our asses out of bed at 6 this morning and why this meeting couldn't wait until this afternoon?" "I do have other clients, you know." "You wouldn't know it, hearing you talk a few minutes ago," Johnny replied. "Don't get cocky, Whitehorse. I'm having lunch with Brad Pitt next week. If I'm lucky, I could be representing him soon. Tell me you're going to have lunch with DiCaprio and then I'll be impressed." "Swine. Should I remind you that before you signed on with me you were actually considering modeling for romance book covers? As I recall, you came knocking on my door, Ed. You knew a good thing when you saw it. Right. If you'd stayed with that other agent, you'd be doing nothing but cheap butter commercials like Fabio, wiggling your ass at romance book conventions and giving a lot of horny old women postmenopausal orgasms. You're just jealous, Ed." Jack laughed and blew into his hot coffee. "What have I got to be jealous about?" Edwin rubbed his bald head as if it were Aladdin's golden lamp. "Some of the sexiest men in history have been bald." "Yul Brynner, Savalas," Jack added, laughing harder. "That Star Trek captain, what's his name? Patrick something. Face it. Bald as in, gentlemen. Eat your hearts out." Johnny listened to his companions spar a while longer as he sipped his hot coffee and thought just how to delicately break the news that he intended to marry Leah Starr. They wouldn't be pleased, he surmised, glancing from one to the other. But they wouldn't be the only ones. Not by a long shot. He set his coffee aside, rubbed his sleepy, burning eyes, and took a deep breath. Raising his voice to be heard over the men's cajoling, he announced, "Gentlemen, I'm getting married." Sudden silence, then they all asked in a woeful tone, "To whom?" "Leah, of course. Who else? If she agrees, we're flying to Vegas day after tomorrow." Ed's eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses and his face flushed with hot color. There were flecks of white icing on his lips that fell like little snowflakes onto the front of his suit as he stared down at Johnny. "Shit," he groaned. "I was afraid you were going to say that." Jack, balancing his rolls on one knee, stared off into space, as he always did when he was attempting to contain his mortification over a sudden turn of events. Anderson, on the other hand, reached for the pocket tape recorder he always kept within grabbing distance and began to murmur directives for his secretary into it. "Let me understand this precisely." Edwin attempted to swallow his partially chewed pastry. "You've just sauntered into this room and announced that you are marrying Senator Foster's daughter. Or perhaps I misunderstood. Damn it, Johnny, please tell me I've misunderstood." Jack shook his head. "You didn't misunderstand our client, Edwin. The son of a bitch said he's getting married day after tomorrow. To the senator's daughter, no less. Where are my nitroglycerin tablets? Shit, I feel a coronary coming on." Pushing the pause button on the recorder, Anderson scribbled notes on a pad and said, "This doesn't give me much time to write up a prenup." "There won't be a prenup," Johnny replied. They all glared at him and said in unison, "No prenup? What are you, crazy? Have you any idea what you're worth, Whitehorse? I believe you said close to $100 million a few days ago." That's a conservative number. Whitehorse genes alone, there will be no prenup. Edwin tossed the Danish and coffee into the trash, removed his glasses, and nervously cleaned them with his silk tie. You need your head examined. That's it, isn't it? The wreck jarred something loose. Jack dragged his chair in front of Johnny, sat and propped his elbows on his knees. We have to talk, Johnny. A man in your position just doesn't up and get married like that. He snapped his fingers under Johnny's nose. Have you any idea what this could do to your career? You're the most eligible and desired bachelor in this country. Your Fifth Avenue posters alone rake in $2 million a year. Every damned adolescent girl in this country and Europe has got that frigging photograph over her bed. Women will be throwing themselves off of buildings. Johnny laughed and crossed his legs. Don't laugh. Jack shook his head. I'm serious. They buy your jeans for their boyfriends just so they can imagine they are peeling them off of you. Marriage didn't hurt Elvis or McCartney. Hasn't tarnished Cruz. They will build effigies in Leah's image and burn them. Every wacko fan out there will be after her. Besides all of that, Edwin interjected. You spring this a week after Dolores is killed. How is that going to look? You bury one fiancé, then turn right around and marry someone else? I wasn't in love with Dolores. That bullshit that she was my fiancé was her doing, not mine. It would have been a cold day in hell before I married her. Laying aside his notepad and tape recorder, Robert asked, Have you informed Dr. Starr that you intend to accuse her father of attempted murder, and that you had in your hands the proof that you needed that he's heavily involved with Formation Media? Just how and when do you intend to break the news to her that you have every intention of putting her father in prison? On your wedding night? That's it. Edwin shook his head and rubbed the lenses a second time. You're going to marry the woman before the shit hits the fan, aren't you? Because you know that as soon as you accuse her father of corruption, don't forget murder, Jack said. She's history. For God's sake, Johnny, what are you doing? All these years you've kept your nose clean, you move back to Ruidoso and all hell breaks loose. The most desirable women in the world are banging on your door and you up and marry some woman who smells like horse shit and has a retarded kid. Johnny left the chair so fast Edwin had no time to react. Johnny grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and flung him partially over a desk, sending Edwin's glasses flying against the wall and scattering paperweights and magazines over the floor. I don't think I like your attitude, Ed. Need I remind you that I pay you 15% of every cent I make to kiss my ass? Jack and Robert moved up behind him, their faces almost as white as Edwin's. Sorry, Ed managed, doing his best to remain calm. You're about to be even sorrier, you greedy son of a bitch. Now take your goddamn BMW and Rolex watch that I bought you and get the hell out of my sight. You're fired. His green eyes widening and his face totally colorless, Edwin gave Johnny a weak smile. You don't mean that, JW? Sheesh, I didn't mean. Johnny dragged him off the desk and shoved him toward the door. You're finished. Get out. Edwin swept up his glasses and, hands trembling, situated them on his face. He stared at Johnny through two broken lenses. We'll talk later, after you've calmed down a little. Out. As Ed pivoted on his heels and left the room, Johnny turned back to the others. Either of you have anything else to say about my decision? Anderson picked up his briefcase and popped open the locks, tucked the yellow legal pads into a side pouch, situated his recorder into a pocket, then gently closed the case, locking it with a double snap and a click of the combination dial. Only then did he look at Johnny. It's your call, Johnny. It's none of my business who you marry. I will, however, have my associate contact you as soon as possible. His name is Joe Conrad. He's smart and as lethal in a courtroom as they come. He's handled some of the nastiest divorce cases in LA. I suspect that as soon as Leah discovers what you intend to do to her father, you're going to need the likes of Joe. Because by the time the new Mrs. Whitehorse gets through with you, you'll be lucky to have your worshipped testicles intact. Chapter 19. Dressed in a white terry bathrobe, a towel wrapped around her wet hair, Shamika shook her head as if clearing it of cobwebs. Obviously, I'm still hungover from last night and didn't hear you correctly. Johnny Whitehorse asked you to marry him and you said you'd think about it? Dragging a chair back from the kitchen table, Shamika sat down and watched Leah steady Val's hand as he attempted to feed himself a spoonful of Cheerios. Hello, girlfriend? I think you've spent too much time with your arm up horses' butts. Or is it your head? The one love of your life, the most eligible bachelor in this country wants to marry you, and you have to think about it? Val looked up and smiled. Johnny, come see me today, Leah grinned. Yes. Put down that spoon of Cheerios and talk to me, Shamika pleaded, then lowering her voice, added, what is there to think about? You're in love with him, right? The man was the third highest grossing entertainer in the industry last year. You wouldn't have to work another day of your life, and best of all, you wouldn't have to worry about where you're going to get the money to buy Val a new wheelchair, and you have to think about it? Gently wiping Val's face with a damp cloth, Leah shook her head. It's not as simple as it sounds, Shamika. There's a lot of baggage that comes along with marrying Johnny. Excuse me? Shamika wagged her head back and forth and rolled her eyes. I think I could handle that kind of baggage no problem. There's his career to consider. You telling me you couldn't handle a few million women throwing themselves at his feet? Rubbing elbows with the rich and famous? Yachting with royalty? Ooh, honey, I can see us now, basking in the sun on the Riviera. Me coating this beautiful brown body in cocoa butter and flirting with Denzel Washington. Part of Johnny's appeal to women is because he's not married. You know what women are like. Once their idol marries, the women's fantasies go up in smoke. They move on to the next hunk they can fantasize sweeping them off their feet and into the nearest bed. So what? So let them. Fact is, honey, Johnny Whitehorse could never pose half-naked again on Fifth Avenue or flash his cute butt on NYPD Blue and still be filthy rich. He's a smart man. He invests wisely. I get the impression that he's ready to move out of show business anyway and into. A look of realization crossed Shamika's face, and she slowly sat back in the chair, laced her fingers together on the table, and took a weary breath. Senator Foster wouldn't have anything to do with your hesitancy, would he? I can hardly ignore the fact that there are major problems between Johnny and my father. There are a lot of fathers-in-law who don't like their daughters' husbands. It all boils down to who you want to spend the rest of your life with, your father or Johnny. I think the problems go a bit deeper than simply their liking one another. I can't believe you'd let him come between you and Johnny again. For heaven's sake, Leah. The man virtually ignores your existence. She glanced down at Val meaningfully, then shook her head. If Johnny's able to get past it, you should be able to as well. And who knows, if you two were to marry, maybe Johnny would lay off your father. For your sake. Wrong. Johnny would never go against his own principles, not if he feels very strongly on an issue. It isn't in his character. Who knows, maybe Johnny simply looks at me as a way to get even with my father. Shamika's jaw dropped. You don't mean that. The man is crazy in love with you. And Val too. Her face warming, Leah moved to the kitchen sink and turned on the cold water. She rinsed the milk and Cheerios out of the dishcloth and stared out the window, to the distant horizon where the highest peaks and chimneys of what once had been her home thrust up behind the rolling green pasture dotted with grazing broodmares. Shamika moved up behind her. You are in love with him, aren't you? You haven't suddenly discovered that what you two shared those years ago was nothing more than infatuation? Because if you're not in love with Johnny, then this whole conversation is moot. The last thing you want to do is marry some jackass again just for security. Leah pressed the damp cloth to her cheeks, doing her best to block from her mind the hours of mindless passion she had spent in Johnny's arms the night before. Johnny loves kids, she said wearily, unfolding and refolding the soggy rag. That's obvious, Shamika replied softly. He's crazy about Val, and Val's crazy about him. Leah smiled dreamily as she recalled the many hours they had lain together, too much in love to think of anything beyond the merging of their bodies and souls. When we were young, we vowed to have several children. Moving around her, Shamika crossed her arms, leaned one hip against the counter, and waited for Leah to continue. Leah shrugged and avoided looking at her concerned friend. He'll want more children, Shamika. And that's what's got you worried? Looking over her shoulder at Val, watching him struggle to pluck Cheerios off the table, struggling even harder to put them in his mouth, Leah shook her head. The doctors have already said that I'll always have problems carrying a child full term. And you're frightened that this will happen again. Shamika took Leah's hand in hers. The doctors have assured you there are remedies for the problem. There's no reason why you shouldn't be capable of carrying a baby for 9 months. Besides, it wasn't the premature issue that caused Val's problem. It was the meningitis. But we both know that extreme premature babies are at high risk for CP. It won't happen again, Leah. I just don't think I'm strong enough to go through this again, Shamika. So what does that mean? You're going to spend the rest of your life alone, refusing to marry any man who wants children? The phone rang and Shamika left the room. Leah followed, hoping Jake had not decided to renege on his decision to give her the day off. She'd promised Val a picnic lunch at the park, Johnny to join them as soon as he finished his business meeting. Shamika laid the receiver down and looked around. It's your father, she said in an exasperated tone. Leah darling. Have I caught you at a bad time? Leah glanced at Shamika where she stood in the doorway, hands on her hips and terry robe fallen open, revealing her pink flannel nightgown. No, Dad. Not at all. What a surprise to hear from you this morning. I'm in town for a few days and would love to meet you for lunch. Gee. I would have liked that, with a little notice. I'm afraid I have plans for lunch. Now what, or who, could be more important than your old man? My son, she replied pointedly. I promised him a picnic at the park. I see. A familiar silence ensued. Leah could imagine her father sitting behind a desk in some posh hotel room, surrounded by his fawning aides, stiff as a poker in his dull gray suit, mouth pressed in an effort to contain his irritation over not getting his way. It was that same look that had made her, as a child, dig her heels into the carpet to keep from running from the room, but that would have given him far too much satisfaction. What about dinner? He finally said. What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to share some time with my daughter? Normally. He laughed, ignoring her sarcasm. Shall we meet at La Hacienda, say 7-ish? That is still your favorite restaurant, isn't it? She nodded, aware that Shamika was watching her like the proverbial hawk and not liking what she was hearing one little bit. Fine, she finally responded. I'll have a car pick you up at 6:30 sharp. And by the way, we'll discuss that funding idea for the special needs issue that was recently proposed by your friend. What's her name? Darman? The phone clicked in her ear before she could recover from her surprise enough to respond. Leah, if I didn't know better, I'd think that man had bugs planted in this house. It's just a little too coincidental that he shows up out of nowhere to see you the very morning after Johnny proposed. Leah dropped the receiver onto the hook. You're actually starting to sound like Johnny, as if there is some conspiracy behind my father wanting to have dinner with me. Well, don't you think it's a little coincidental? She scanned the room, feeling a niggling of unease raise the hairs on her arms. There were dozens of photographs scattered over the tables and on the walls, smiling images of Leah and her mother, her grandparents, and Val. A few sickly Boston ferns lightened up dark corners. The sadly sagging sofa and matching chair with ottoman had been the first household items she and Richard had purchased from a garage sale shortly before their marriage. All appeared so normal and safe and familiar. No listening device buried like a reclusive spider within the leaves of ferns or behind heartwarming photographs. You've been reading too many Robert Ludlum and John Grisham novels, Shamika. He said he has some time off. When is the last time he did that, Leah? I'm telling you, he's come to town for a reason, and that reason is you and Johnny. Why would he spy on me? I'm his daughter, for heaven's sake. It's not you he's worried about, Leah. Is it? It's Johnny that's got him jumpy, and you'd better believe he's going to do whatever he can to make certain Johnny doesn't cause him any more grief than necessary. So what has all that got to do with me? If he can't get to Johnny through Johnny, he'll get to Johnny through you. Leah turned her back on Shamika and retreated to her bedroom, closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her gaze fixed on the unmade bed, sheets and blanket a tangle, the pillow Johnny had slept on still showing the indentation of his head. Even the smell of him lingered in the room, the slightly musky, spicy scent of his cologne, his sweat, the odor of the hot fierce sex they had shared throughout the night. No way, she said aloud, shaking her head. He's my father, for God's sake. No way could he know about me and Johnny. Closing her eyes, she repeated, no way. The idea of picnicking at the park had been a good one. A blanket spread under a tree overlooking the meandering river, enjoying fried chicken, potato salad from the local deli, and Twinkies, Val's choice for dessert, with strawberry Kool-Aid for a beverage. A time to relax, forget about the mounting pressures in their lives, reminisce about the old days, and plan for the new ones, should Leah allow herself to consider Johnny's proposal. But Leah had no more spread the red and white checked blanket out over the trimmed grass, and Johnny had no more situated Val in his brace on the blanket when a group of teenage girls in brief bikinis and piña colada-scented suntan oil recognized Johnny, despite his dark glasses and Roy's old sweat-stained cowboy hat that he had pulled down over his brow, and screamed loud enough to bring every woman with or without a camera running as fast as they could. Within minutes they were swamped. Women thrust pen and paper at Johnny, and if they had no paper they offered miscellaneous body parts. Leah was forced to collect Val and rush him back to the truck, where they sat in the front seat and watched Johnny fight his way toward them as if he were swimming through piranhas. The blanket and picnic lunch did not fare any better. The blanket was torn into souvenirs and the food was scattered for the ants and lurking squirrels. By the time Johnny climbed into the truck, slammed the door and locked it, his hat was gone and so were his glasses. The black and orange t-shirt boasting Apache Rodeo Championship June 1-5 had been ripped in 2 places. There were fingernail scratches on his arms and one across his cheek. He reached for the ignition just as a girl climbed onto the hood of his truck and flattened her naked breasts against the windshield. Johnny looked at Leah, his dark eyebrows raised. Leah covered Val's eyes with her hands and began to laugh. This isn't funny, Johnny said, motioning to the girl to get off his truck, then hitting the windshield wipers, causing the blades to swipe at the girl's nipples. Still, she didn't budge, just pressed her lips against the window and proceeded to tell him exactly what she was willing to give him if he'd just autograph her crotch. Leah laughed harder as Johnny's face turned red. Her eyes watered and her ribs ached, and the idea occurred to her that she couldn't remember the last time she had laughed so hard. He shifted the truck into first gear and revved the engine, then popped the clutch, causing the truck to buck like a pissed mule. The girl tumbled off the side and Johnny floored the accelerator. The tires spun momentarily on the asphalt, spitting gravel before the truck careened toward the highway, leaving the waving, jiggling, squealing women behind. Johnny glanced down at Val, who grinned back at him. "You okay, pal?" "Okay, pal." He looked at Leah as she bit her lip to keep from laughing again. "What's so funny about getting torn limb from limb?" "I was just remembering how shy you were in school. You blushed every time a girl looked at you. I hate it. What makes women behave like that? That's what you get for posing half naked on Fifth Avenue and exposing your cute ass on NYPD Blue. Thanks for your support. Hey, you stud muffins make yourselves into gods to these women, then you whine because you can't saunter through life with some semblance of privacy. If they weren't tearing your clothes off, you'd be whining about their indifference. There's no pleasing you. You don't write for tabloids, do you?" She pursed her lips and looked thoughtful. "I just might if you're not nice to me. I think they'd pay a pretty sum for the juicy details of our meeting last night. Just as long as you tell them I'm the best you ever had. I have my reputation to think about." "Best what?" Val asked, looking from Leah to Johnny, making Leah grimace and Johnny grin like the Cheshire Cat. Friend, Leah declared, tweaking his nose. Best friend I ever had. Val is Mama's best friend, Val announced, giving Johnny a stern look, then smiling. Johnny can be Val's best friend. Smiling, Johnny slid his arm around Val's shoulder, and his tone became conspiratorial. I'll be more than your best friend soon if your mom will stop being so stubborn. I'm not stubborn, Leah argued, shaking her head. I'm simply being cautious. You've never been cautious. Stubborn, yes. Cautious, no. I just don't want to throw open some Pandora's box, Johnny. There's a lot to consider. And if you deny that, then you're not thinking with your head. You sound like my agents. Leah raised her eyebrows. Oh. Then I take it they aren't exactly jumping with joy over the possibility of our. She glanced down at Val, who watched her intently. I just think we need to discuss the situations that might arise. We should take our time. Get to know one another again. We're not the same people we were 12 years ago. I know I never stopped loving you, he said softly, and reached for her hand. Will you sit there and deny to me that you feel the same? No. She shook her head and wrapped her fingers around his. They rode in silence as Johnny wove the truck through traffic, heavy due to the influx of weekend tourists. He pulled through a Jack-in-the-Box and ordered hamburgers and French fries to go, piled the warm, fragrant sacks of food on Val's lap so the boy could filch himself some fries, then directed the truck down the highway and onto the Mescalero reservation. Leah said nothing, just watched the mountainous scenery flash by, hardly questioning in her own mind why Johnny would head for the reservation. Like so many years ago, it was the one place he could lose himself. There wasn't a trail, a river, a valley, or a mountain for that matter, that he had not explored thoroughly, mostly to escape his father's drunken rages. Just as he had done after Dolores's death, he would search for and find a place that would provide them emotional comfort and physical security. He needed to be on his ground to deal with her so-called stubbornness. The actual town of Mescalero was a compilation of modern buildings and rock and frame structures. Heat radiated off the street and the cracked, meandering sidewalks, bleaching color from the surroundings. A scattering of small stores boasted barriers across their windows and signs, for sale. Out of business. Closed. Johnny drove by them slowly and pointed to an adobe building with dull red shutters and a bright orange door, the windows broken out despite the lumber that had been nailed over them. Bill Crow's place. He sank every dime into it 5 years ago. His wife made baskets and pottery in back. They netted $25,000 last year, enough to send their daughter to college out east. Anna made the finest baskets in New Mexico. They were bought by tourists from all over the world. Frowning, Leah looked over the weed-infested, trash-littered building. What happened? He pointed to a small grocery across the street, the mom-and-pop sort that roused images of creaky wood floors and penny bubblegum. Ragged, faded going-out-of-business banners flapped like tattered flags from their moorings on the dusty windows. Last year Hank and Helen Crookneck finally saved enough money from the store to build them a nice house on the mountain. They sank their savings into the house, but no sooner did they move in than they were forced to close the store. They went bankrupt and are now subsidized by the government. Turning off the main street, he moved by a parking lot jammed with Native American men, women, and children, all idling under whatever shade they could find, fanning themselves with anything that might provide them a breeze. There were young men with dark, angry faces, old men with haggard expressions, and women who stared blankly out over the countryside, ignoring the crying children who tugged on their skirts that were as faded of color as the going-out-of-business banners. The sign posted on the employment office behind them read, "Closed until further notice by order of the United States government." The government felt that since there really are no jobs to provide these people, it would do no good to staff the office. So the office was closed 4 months ago. These people congregate here waiting for the occasional contractor or builder to come looking for a worker for a few hours or a few days. The old men work cheap, usually half of minimum wage. Anything to put food on the table, but the work is hard on them, so the builders are forced to hire the younger men who demand a higher wage. The women will scrub floors and toilets for food for their children. Some of the restaurants in the area will bring them in after closing and pay them with food that was left over from the day's business. 2 years ago, these people looked very different. Their faces weren't hollow and their eyes were bright. The children laughed instead of cried. 2 years ago, you would not have found these people loitering around parking lots. They had jobs then, working for the businesses that are now closed. He directed the truck north, following the highway into the hills, through expanses of towering trees where the heat became a cool, dim relief. As the air conditioner hummed and the tires droned, Val's eyes closed and his head nodded. Only then did Leah look directly at Johnny, who stared straight ahead, one wrist hooked over the steering wheel, one hand lying on Val's knee. Upon exiting the tunnel of trees, Johnny slowed the truck and pulled off the road, onto a vast empty parking lot that wrapped around an expanse of partially constructed buildings, their frames and beams fast being overtaken by wildflowers, weeds, and thistle trees. Johnny stopped the truck and killed the engine. Without looking at Leah, he reached for the door and said, "Get out." Leah did not get out. It had occurred to her as she'd studied the weary faces of the unemployed mesaleros just what Johnny was getting at, the point he would try to make concerning the welfare of his people and their future. A sickness settled in her stomach. The greasy French fries in a sack on Val's lap didn't help, any more than the vision of the mescalero dream gone bad. The corroding steel ribs of the buildings rising up behind weeds as tall as a man resembled a dinosaur graveyard. Johnny walked around the truck and opened the door. He offered his hand. "Why are you doing this?" she asked in a dry voice. "What are you afraid of?" "I have no intention of listening to you character bash my father." "I don't intend to. I simply intend to show you what a people's failed dream looks like." She left the truck, easing the door closed so as not to disturb Val. Johnny walked away from her, toward the stretches of partially constructed walls made all the more bleak by the flocks of birds that rose up in a cloud of caws and popping wings from the stark steel structures high over Johnny's head. Shivering, Leah hugged herself and glanced at the dark blue sky with its feathering of thin clouds, and the conversation she had shared that morning with Shamika came back to her. No matter how much she wanted to ignore or deny that there were problems between Johnny and her father, the evidence sprawled out before her now was a reminder that there were more reasons than Johnny's career to avoid any talk of marriage. A fallen billboard lay on the ground. Future home of Apache Casino and Resort. Financing by Formation Media. "What do you think, Leah? This is all that's left of the people's dream." Johnny jumped onto a pile of rubble, spread his arms and slowly turned. The casino alone would have offered 2,500 slot machines and 200 tables, roulette, blackjack, Big Six, poker. 6 restaurants would have offered guests everything from Native American fare to French cuisine, open 24 hours a day. He pointed to an arch of steel beams some distance away. That was to be the theater where major concerts and gaming tournaments would have been held. It could have seated 15,000. There would have been 40 shops selling everything from pottery, baskets, and beadwork, all made by the New Mexico tribes, to designer originals from Paris. The hotel would have had 1,500 rooms. An 18-hole golf course was planned, as well as a riding stable, a theme park for kids, and an outdoor theater where the people would perform their dances in a setting that represented the different Apache villages of 100 years ago. Turning his face into the breeze, Johnny looked down on the crystal-clear lake in the valley below. Sun danced upon the surface like silver glitter. The lake would have offered swimming, boating, fishing, water skiing. And in the winter we would have provided trams to the slopes for a day of snow skiing. He remained silent after that, lost in thought, his dark hair reflecting the sun. Finally, he turned back to Leah and jumped from his perch. Almost angrily, he swept his hand toward the stretch of highway that disappeared around a sharp bend in the road. By the year 2020, this area would have rivaled Branson, Missouri, Atlantic City, or Vegas with casinos, hotels, and theaters. Every family residing on this reservation would have known employment and financial stability for themselves and their children's children. Finally, he met Leah's eyes. 60% of the financing for this initial casino and hotel project was to come from the Apache Consortium, not just the Mescalero but from all the New Mexico tribes. Therefore, they would hold the majority control of the running of the business. They mortgaged their homes and businesses. They took what little life savings they had and invested in this dream. Formation Media would invest the other 40%, plus act as the private moneylender to those who mortgaged their homes and businesses or used their homes, businesses, or personal effects as collateral. If, for some reason, the majority failed, 100% of the control and ownership reverted to Formation Media. Had everything gone as planned, the building of the resort would have been completed last year. By now, this place would have been filled with tourists gambling, enjoying the theme park, swimming, browsing the shops for souvenirs that weren't made in Taiwan. Instead of loitering on parking lots hoping for some white man to toss a few coins their way, the people would be here, employed, productive, proud of their accomplishments and, most of all, realizing their dreams of prosperity for the first time since they were corralled on this land like cattle and forced to become something they aren't. In 1995, the governor signed gambling compacts allowing the tribes to begin the construction of the resort. What you see here is how far the construction got before your father brought it to the attention of the state and federal courts that the compacts the governor signed were void because he did not get approval for the gambling from the legislature. Under federal Indian gaming law, a tribe cannot legally run a casino without an agreement with the state legislature. You can't fault my father for following the law, Johnny. I don't fault your father for following the law, Leah. I fault him for continually thwarting our attempts to get the legislature to alter the state's gambling laws. He fought us on every avenue, pointing out how gambling will introduce corruption, exacerbate alcoholism, weaken the Apache's character further by allowing them an opportunity to gamble away what little money they have, therefore disintegrating the dignity of an already diminished people. He pointed out that the people, as a whole, are lacking the education necessary to successfully manage and maintain such a broad endeavor as we proposed in the building of this casino and resort. Leah turned away, shaking her head. You're not making sense, Johnny. My father eventually compromised on the issue and the state, not 6 months ago, negotiated new compacts allowing gambling. Better late than never? He shook his head. Not in this case, Leah. Not when the ownership of the casino and resort reverted to Formation Media when the people could not make their payments when due. Formation now owns this resort, lock, stock, and barrel. They can either build it or walk away and leave it to the coyotes and jackrabbits. If they build, they are under no obligation to employ a Native American anywhere on the premises and most likely won't. They'll move in their employees from other resorts and casinos, as they've done in the past. As Leah frowned and started to speak, Johnny cut her off. Formation Media is owned by a group of international investors. We're not certain who they are. They go by numbers, not names. They've developed some of the largest and most successful hotel casinos in the world. Most recently, they built the Shanghai Vista in Reno. It takes up 20 complete city blocks. I've read about the Shanghai Vista, that there's no other casino hotel like it in the world, and to visit is like actually visiting Shanghai in person. Every minute detail is authentic. I had no idea it was developed by Formation. It's authentic all right, down to the Fuzhou Road that's lined with bookshops, gift shops and the Xinhua Bakery, to Zhongshandong Avenue, which looks out over a man-made reproduction of the Huangpu River. There are the same number of slot machines as there are rooms in the hotel. 5,000. The only thing missing is the mosquitoes and the monsoons. So what are you insinuating, Johnny? That my father manipulated this entire fiasco so that Formation could get their hands on this project? My God, this is small potatoes compared to the Shanghai Vista. Not if you look at the big picture, Leah. The only thing that kept Branson, Missouri, from hurting Vegas or Atlantic City was the fact that they don't have gambling. And what, exactly, would my father get out of it? That's pretty damn obvious, isn't it? Money. Lots of it. Enough to finance his next campaign. Or maybe he simply wants a bite of the action. As usual, the senator had acquired the best table La Hacienda had to offer. Situated on a private balcony, it offered a panoramic view of the entire valley and the river that reflected the sky and clouds like a flawless mirror. There had been times during her childhood when the three of them, her mother, father, and herself, had come here to celebrate certain occasions. Her birthday, Mother's Day, graduation. She always ordered enchiladas mexicana. Her mother varied, tacos el carbon, fajitas, sometimes nothing but a vodka and tonic, depending on how the conversation had gone in the car on the way over. Leah's father raised his glass of wine to her, drawing her attention back to the present. To my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Here's hoping that the future will bring us much closer. She touched her glass to his, but did not drink. Instead, she placed it aside and sat back in her chair. What's this all about, Dad? The last time we had dinner together, Mom was still alive. Gee, that must have been 4 years ago, when the two of you flew down to College Station for my graduation. You're my daughter, for God's sake. I have a right to see you occasionally. He laughed. Is there some law against it? Senator, you never do anything without a motive. Remember? You're too busy to fit such normalities as having dinner with your family into your hectic schedule. Good Lord. You sound like your mother. He gave her a thin smile and a slight narrowing of his eyes. The two of you were always blessed with a razor-sharp wit, not to mention an equally destructive tongue. But tonight I bow to you. I did not, regretfully, spend enough time at home with my family. Foster finished off his glass of wine. So how is the new job going? I haven't actually started practicing yet. Simply assisting Jake. Until my state license comes through, I don't dare even take a horse's temperature. But the money is good? It's steady and reliable. The work is hard and occasionally heartbreaking. That, however, is nothing new. Which brings me to the basic reason for asking you here tonight. Ah. I knew there had to be some ulterior motive. What do you want from me, Senator? Don't tell me you've decided to get back into the horse business. Perhaps you want me to do a pre-purchase exam on an incredible Arabian stallion you found in Cairo? I warn you, I'm not cheap. And I don't lie. I'm known in the business, at least in Dallas, for being brutally honest. No horses, Leah. I'm done with that. Besides, your mother was far crazier about the horses than I ever was. This time I'm going to do something for you. What would you think about working for me, in Washington? I need someone trustworthy and dedicated, someone willing to look out for her old man's tail when it gets in a crack. I could start you off at $50,000 a year, living accommodations included. Of course, it would mean you're moving permanently to Washington, rubbing elbows with men in high places. I've heard there is a lot more getting rubbed in Washington than elbows these days. I'll point out that DC offers certain advantages for your son. His name is Valentino, Dad, just in case you forgot. Of course I haven't forgot. For God's sake, Leah, why must you always get so defensive every time I bring up the boy? The fact that you haven't asked about his welfare since I sat down here 30 minutes ago might have something to do with it. Sorry. I've not been blessed with the gift of idle chit-chat. You know that. I never considered asking about the welfare of your only grandchild, nothing more than mere chit-chat. She reached for her wine, her throat growing tight with emotion. Let me save you the trouble. Val is doing beautifully. He's beginning to read. His speech has improved tremendously. He'll never walk, of course, but the therapy he receives every day helps his hand coordination tremendously. We finally managed to get the seizures under control. The medication for that is astronomical, but necessary. There are medications available now that help to relieve the rigidity of the muscles. They're still in a somewhat experimental stage. She drank again, more deeply, before adding, "The series of shots is given every 3 months. 7 shots in each arm and leg, directly into the muscles, at a cost of $2,000 a series. And there's no guarantee that they'll work for every case. But when they do, the results allow the individual a much greater range of movement and balance, not to mention comfort." Val enjoys school very much. He's the teacher's pet. He's attending summer school now, where the emphasis is more on social activities rather than studies. There are swimming activities and games that help with coordination and sportsmanship. What's most important is the time he spends with other children like himself. It assures him that he's not alone in the world. That there are others, like him, who are special. Of course, the program isn't subsidized by the government, but by private donations. Which is why Shelley Darman contacted you, in hopes you would propose to the state legislature the possibility of the state footing the bill for the program. The rattletrap bus they are forced to ride is inadequate, to say the least. It's continually breaking down. It's not air-conditioned. And while there have been alterations in the bus to accommodate the special needs of the children, it's still lacking the appropriate appointments to guarantee their safety 100%. "I'll look into it," he said in his typical dismissive tone that told her he would not look into it, that as soon as they walked out the door the subject would be buried in his mind. The waitress appeared to take their order. As her father quickly perused the menu one last time, Leah sat back in her chair and watched him, the same way she had often observed her mother studying him, with a sense of curiosity and confusion, disappointment and frustration settling like stone in her chest. When, she wondered, had her father become the cold, remote, and indifferent man who now sat before her? Had he always been so emotionally unattached to everything but power? Surely not. Knowing her mother, who thrived on attention, Leah could not imagine the woman marrying for any other reason but love. "What happened between you and Mother?" she asked when the waitress retreated. "When, exactly, did you fall out of love?" If he was surprised by the suddenness of her unusual question, he didn't show it, just wiped his mouth with the white linen napkin and laid it in his lap. "Your mother and I had different interests. That didn't necessarily mean we didn't care for one another. I never saw you touch her. You slept in separate bedrooms since I was 10. I lived a very hectic and intrusive life, Leah. Always getting calls in the middle of the night. I simply didn't wish to disturb her. Besides, it afforded both of us much greater freedom. Did it matter to you that she took lovers?" He laughed. "Sweetheart, your mother was welcome to entertain herself any way she wanted, as long as it kept her pacified and sober and away from the American Express card." She supposed she should have been surprised by his blasé attitude. But she wasn't. Just irritated that he didn't have the decency to indicate even the slightest annoyance over the fact that his wife had been unfaithful, which only proved all the more that he had not cared a whit about her. "You were never jealous? Not even a little?" she pressed. "I simply expected her to be discreet, and to exhibit a modicum of selectivity in the men she chose to sleep with." "Is that why you hated Jefferson Whitehorse so much? Because you didn't like Mother fucking an Indian?" For the first time in her life, Leah watched her father's face flood with dark color. He sat back in his chair, shoulders squared, jaw bulging. Even the whites of his eyes turned blood red as he fixed her with so smoldering a look she wondered if he would actually explode in this room full of prospective voters. Bingo! She thought. At long last she had finally discovered his Achilles heel. A spiteful satisfaction surged like a bubble in her chest. "For the love of God, Leah, is that any way to talk? I thought your mother had taught you better etiquette." "My mother taught me several four-letter words, some of which would make your blood pressure go up even more. Would you like to hear them? They were mostly directed at you anyway." "Fine," he snapped. "As long as you want to bring up the foster women's penchant for screwing Indians, why don't you enlighten me as to your plans with Johnny Whitehorse? I wondered how long it would take you to get around to Johnny." "You've been seen with him." Her eyebrows lifted. "Maybe Shamika is right. Maybe you have planted a bug under my bed." "How could you?" he said through his teeth, glancing around to make certain his tone had not caught anyone's attention. You know what that son of a bitch is trying to do to me, and yet you still. What is he trying to do that any activist who truly cares about a cause wouldn't do? You screwed over his people, Senator. You bankrupted an entire populace. Why? What the hell are you talking about, Leah? I'm talking about the game you played with the gambling issue. You're stalling the legislature's legalizing state gambling until the tribal investors of the Apache Casino and Resort rolled over, giving Formation Media full ownership of the development. Foster tossed his napkin on the table and, for an instant, looked as if he would spring from his chair and make a quick exit from the restaurant. How dare you, he uttered under his breath, pinning her with his blue eyes that, despite the fire of anger in his face, looked frigid. The look set her back and made her heart skip with disconcertment. A chill as cold as ice melt sluiced through every vein and bone and muscle. Fine, sweetheart. If that's the way you want to play this, fine. Give your boyfriend a message for me. I won't stand for his slandering me. I won't tolerate the charges he's made about collusion. If he thinks he's going to unseat me the next election, he'd better be prepared to lock up his closets, because I don't intend to leave any rock unturned in my efforts to smash his character and reputation, starting with the death of Dolores Rainwater. As steadily as possible, she said, "You still haven't answered my question, Senator. Exactly what was your motive behind stalling the gambling issue?" He pointed one trembling finger in her face. "I've offered you a job, Leah. A new beginning. Financial stability. If I were you, I would consider it. On the other hand, if you take a stand with Whitehorse against me, in fact, if you continue to see him at all, I sever all ties between us. You are no longer my daughter. Think about that while you enjoy your dinner." Scraping back his chair, Foster stood and exited the restaurant. Chapter 20. Talia's Dancin' Darlin' was the favorite for the night's biggest race, offering the highest purse of the season so far, $45,000, the winner taking 60%. A groom had found her on her side that morning in her stall, obviously having been rolling. Not a good sign. That meant colic. By the looks of her beat-up hocks and the bruising on her head, she'd been floundering in her stall for the better part of the night. They had pumped enough mineral oil through her gut to grease a Boeing 747. Had there been an obstruction, it should have passed by now. Instead of showing signs of improvement, the mare appeared to be growing worse. Respiration, heartbeat, temperature were climbing. Both Jake and Leah suspected a gut twist, which meant surgery. But even that outcome was iffy, certainly no guarantee that they could save the suffering mare. Especially if the gut had been twisted for a long period of time. Jake shook his head. "I can't do anything else for her without opening her up, Mr. Davison. Or we can put her down. That's your call, of course. Either way, this mare isn't running tonight or any time in the foreseeable future." Bill Davison closed his eyes briefly, and his shoulders slumped. Behind him, his wife Betty began to cry. Both in their late 50s, they had spent their lives breeding for the horse that would make their farm respected in the business. Talia's Dancin' Darlin', named after their granddaughter, Talia, had shown every promise of doing just that. She had broken her maiden the first time out, going on to win 5 of the next 7 races. "Will she ever run again?" Bill asked. "Maybe. Maybe not. Founder usually follows this kind of colic, and that means lameness. If she survives, she might make you one hell of a brood mare." Jake ran his hand along the mare's sweating neck. "She's a nice horse. She's made you some decent money. If she was mine, I'd open her up. Give her every chance. Easy for you to say. It ain't as if I've got $5,000 ready to toss down the crapper if she dies." The mare's trainer laid his hand on Davison's shoulder. "You gotta do what you gotta do, Bill. There will be other horses. Don't beat yourself up over this." Davison turned his gaze to Leah where she stood at Jake's side, her heart in her throat as she wondered to herself if she would ever get used to witnessing the pain on her clients' faces when confronted with life and death decisions regarding their animals, and, more often than not, the end of their dreams. "It's a hell of a thing, isn't it?" Bill said. "You pour your heart and soul into raising these beauties. You pamper them like they was the Queen of England, invest half a lifetime of money and dreams. 1 minute they're fine, on top of the world, the next they're useless for anything other than jello." He ran one hand through his hair and cleared his throat. "I'll call my brother, see if he can loan me the money." Davison, his wife, and the trainer headed for the door, and Jake gave his assistants orders to prepare the mare for surgery. "Shouldn't you wait until Mr. Davison returns?" Leah asked, raising her voice to be heard over the roaring of the lifts that would move the anesthetized horse onto the operating table. She followed Jake into the scrub room, grabbed up a surgical gown that was sterilized in plastic bags and began to slide the garment on over her clothes. Jake turned on the water and began to brush his hands with disinfectant. "There isn't time to wait," he said as she moved up beside him and began to scrub. "I suspect we'll be lucky to save her as it is. But the money, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, doctor. I've known Bill a long time. He'll come across with the money. It might take a while, but he'll pay me." Within 15 minutes the mare was on the table, flat on her back, tubes running out her nose and mouth, her feet supported by chains from the overhead lift. Leah prepped the mare's belly, shaved away the hair with a number 40 surgical clipper blade, and swabbed the skin down with betadine scrub. Then Jake stepped in and opened her up. Leah gagged and turned her face away. Jake cursed, flinging the scalpel to the far side of the room. Leah had not wanted to be present when Jake broke the news to Bill and Betty Davison that their horse was dead, that the colon had been twisted so long it had ruptured, spilling poisons throughout her body cavity. Sitting in a lawn chair outside the clinic, the sun hot on her face, Leah closed her eyes and did her best to will away the stench of peritonitis that permeated even her hair. She wanted to go home and spend a long, lazy Sunday afternoon with Val. They would cuddle in the hammock hanging from the pine trees out back of the house until the heat got too unbearable, then they would put on their swimsuit and play in the blue wading pool until their shoulders became sensitive to the sun. They would nap, snack on microwave popcorn, watch old Godzilla movies and laugh until their sides hurt. Or she could march into the clinic and tell Jake that she was taking tomorrow off because she was flying to Las Vegas with Johnny Whitehorse. Yes, Johnny Whitehorse, and they were going to get married in some tacky little chapel with a justice of the peace who looked, talked, and dressed like Elvis. In all probability she would not return to work because she would no longer need to work to pay for her son's therapy, medications, wheelchairs, and $1,000 bathtub seats that were nothing more than molded plastic and which Val would outgrow in another 3 months. Jake would say in his typical dry manner, "You're joking, right? Allow a man to take care of you? I thought you were a millennium kind of girl, too independent to rely on a man." Then he would remark, "What about the senator? How is he going to take the news that his only daughter has gone over to the enemy? Her father the enemy?" Even after their meeting last night she couldn't bring herself to believe Johnny's innuendos that her father was in bed with Formation Media. That he had, in some way, played a part in the bankruptcy of the Apache Casino and Resort. Then she reminded herself that the fallout of the bankruptcy didn't affect just the resort, but an entire state of people who had sunk their entire lives into a dream that had left thousands destitute. Granted, Senator Foster might never win Husband or Father of the Year, but she refused to believe that he was the kind of man who would destroy another for financial gain. "Mind if I join you?" She looked around as Jake sat down beside her, a Diet Cola in one hand, his stethoscope in the other. He had changed out of his surgical smock. His shirt was pale blue and his jeans were faded to the point of being white. He needed to shave. His eyes looked weary and sad. "How did they take it?" she asked. "Better than I expected. He's lucky to have a wife like Betty. She'll get him through it. They'll be back next year with another contender. Bill raises good horses." He swigged the cola and regarded her closely. Why do I get the impression you'd rather be someplace else today? Wouldn't you? He shrugged. Not really. Don't you have a social life? Are you asking me if I have a girlfriend? He grinned. Yeah. Leah laughed. I guess I am. If I didn't read the papers, I'd think you were flirting with me. As Leah frowned, Jake got up and walked back into the office. He reappeared with a newspaper that he tossed into her lap. She stared down at an image of herself, Val, and Johnny, taken the day before at the park, just moments before they were forced to run for their lives from Johnny's fans. Below that was a photograph of her father attending a Clinton White House function. Whitehorse to marry senator's daughter. Sources close to Johnny Whitehorse have indicated that wedding bells will soon be ringing for America's most eligible bachelor. Identified as Leah Foster Starr, only daughter of Senator Carl Foster, the two have been seen together frequently, despite the tragic accident that recently took the life of Whitehorse's fiancée, Dolores Rainwater, news anchor for KRXR Channel 10. Starr, who practices veterinary medicine, recently returned to Ruidoso after a 12-year absence, during which time she married Richard Starr, graduated from Texas A&M University, and practiced medicine in Pilot Point, Texas. Dr. Starr and her husband were divorced 4 years ago. Problems between Whitehorse and Senator Foster have been ongoing since Foster stood hard against the compact reformation allowing gambling on the New Mexico reservations. Whitehorse, representing the New Mexico tribes, subsequently sued the state of New Mexico for its refusal to negotiate in good faith, and to force it to work out a compact. However, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed the state's sovereign immunity to lawsuits by Indian tribes in gambling compact matters. 6 months later, Foster, in an act of goodwill toward the state's Native Americans, reversed his stand and spearheaded the legalization of casino gambling on the state's reservations. Too little, too late, Whitehorse was quoted. Foster's sudden turnaround, coming 8 months after the Apache Casino and Resort development faced bankruptcy and rolled over to Formation Media, smacks of corruption and collusion. I intend to launch a full-scale investigation of the senator and his dealings with Formation Media. I assure the people of this state that Foster has not heard the last of this issue. Comments from the Whitehorse camp neither confirm nor deny that Whitehorse and Starr are to be married this week at an undisclosed location. When contacted late last night for his comments on the rumor, Senator Foster replied only, "Over my dead body." Leah tossed the paper aside just as her pager went off. She glanced at Jake as she reached for it. "For your information, I haven't agreed yet to marry Johnny. And furthermore, any decision I come to will in no way be determined by my father's feelings on the matter." Spoken like a true future politician's wife. She stuck her tongue out at him. He laughed. The pager read, "Call home ASAP." Leah returned to the office and grabbed the phone. It rang only once before Shamika picked it up. "Is Val okay?" Leah asked. "Val is fine. I'm not so sure about me. Listen to this, girlfriend." A racket came over the phone, making Leah remove it from her ear momentarily. Shamika returned. 30 minutes ago, at least 50 newspaper and television reporters appeared on our doorstep with cameras and recorders. "Seems the word is out that you and Johnny, I just read about it in the paper." "Well, so has the rest of the state, apparently. They're swarming over this place like a bunch of locusts. I've had to lock the windows and doors. I swear to God someone tried to shimmy down the chimney a few minutes ago." "Have you heard from Johnny?" "Not yet. If they're this bad here, I can only imagine what they're like at his place." "Oh, your father called." 3 times. He didn't sound happy. "I'll get there as soon as possible." "Don't bother. If I were you, I'd find a place to ride this one out. Let Johnny's people handle it. They're equipped for this sort of thing. What cave do you propose I hide in?" "A very dark one. Gotta go. I think someone just fell off the roof." "Great." Leah slammed down the phone. "I suppose this means I'll get sued. Problems?" She looked around as Jake stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "Problems, you ask? I'd say that's an understatement. No. He shook his head. I'm telling you, you've got problems. 2 television crews just arrived. Unless you want your pretty face plastered all over Inside Edition tonight, I'd suggest you use that door and get the hell out of here. He pointed to the back entrance. I'll stall them as long as I can. Mind telling me where I'm supposed to go? They're swarming all over my house. If I show up at Johnny's, it's only going to add fuel to the fire. He reached into his jeans pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and tossed them to her. Casa Grande Apartments on Grand Avenue. Apartment 210. It's not fancy, but it'll give you a place to crash until Johnny can get the situation under control. Grinning, Leah shook her head. This is crazy. Did you think a relationship with Johnny Whitehorse would be anything else? I didn't think. Period. Johnny's just Johnny to me. I have to remind myself that he's not the same guy the first fell in love with a lifetime ago. You could have done worse. You could have hooked up with a guy like me who's generally pissed off at the world, hasn't voted since I was 22, and would rather spend Sunday afternoons with my arm up horses' asses than with family or friends. Now get out of here before I change my mind and toss you to the sharks. Edwin Fullerman calmly adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat as Johnny paced to the window, peered through the curtains at the swarm of reporters gathered over the grounds, then turned on Edwin again. I swear to you, Johnny. I didn't leak the news of you and Leah. I wouldn't do that even if I was pissed because you fired me. Hell, you've fired me a dozen times over the last 5 years. I don't take those tantrums seriously. You calm down after a few days and I get my job back. You fire me. I kiss your ass. We shake hands and make up and that's that. Christ, if I went around blabbing my clients' confidences to the media, there wouldn't be an entertainer in the business who would return my phone calls. Johnny kicked a chair as hard as he could. It bounced off the wall and tumbled across the floor. Jack entered the library from the adjoining office. Leah's line is busy. The operator says it's off the hook. I tried the track and got hold of Jake Graham. He told me to, and I quote, stick the phone up your butt, fella. The lady isn't here. I identified myself as your employee, but seems he's gotten 24 such employee phone calls in the last hour. Edwin sat on the edge of the desk and crossed his arms. I suspect this marriage thing is going to open up a very big can of worms regarding the issue with the senator and his involvement with Formation Media. Not to mention Dolores's death, if, indeed, he was involved with her death. The papers this morning were already rehashing the casino fiasco and the fact that you won't let it die. If, as you say, you located Rainwater's source, proving that Foster is up to his earlobes in dealings with Formation, then he or she better get the guns ready. The phone rang. Jack left the room to answer it. He returned shortly, his face white. Better turn on the television. The DA is making a statement. The walls of Jake's apartment were stark white, not a solitary object to break the monotony of being surrounded by bright glare. The furnishings, however, were as plush as money could buy. Rich brown leather wraparound sofa and chairs with ottoman. Marble-top credenza with carved mahogany legs, 18th-century French antique, Leah surmised, oriental carpets, a scattering of bronzes, and a few potted tropical plants. There were unpacked boxes stacked in a kitchen that looked as if it had rarely, if ever, been used. Curious, Leah peeked inside the refrigerator to discover a quart of milk, a 6-pack of Mexican beer, and a molding chunk of sharp cheddar cheese from a cheese store at the local mall. The freezer was totally empty. Leah paced the immaculate apartment, checking her watch every few minutes and attempting to call Shamika, then Johnny, to no avail. The lines were constantly busy. She flopped on the sofa with a huff of exasperation and closed her eyes. So much for work. So much for spending a lazy Sunday afternoon on a hammock with her son, or binging on popcorn and laughing at a black and white Godzilla with oriental eyes that had apparently attained its black belt in karate. So much for harboring the slightest inkling that she could marry Johnny Whitehorse and walk off into the sunset like any other blushing bride who had married the love of her entire life. Johnny was not just any Joe Blow. They would not live happily ever after in a little white cottage surrounded by a picket fence. Not if the media had anything to do with it. And not if her father had anything to do with it. When she opened her eyes again, the room had turned semi-dark. A small lamp glowed on a nearby end table. The smell of food and the rattle of pans in the kitchen made her sit up and frown in confusion. Jake exited the kitchen in that moment, a glass of Zinfandel in each hand. "It's about time you woke up." He placed the sweating glass of wine on the table beside her. "Hope you like Chinese and tofu." "I don't eat meat." He grinned. "I took a chance that you would still be here and figured you'd be as hungry as I am." "I'm afraid my fridge doesn't offer much in the way of nutritional supplementation, unless you like cheese 2 months beyond its expiration date." She gave him a sleepy smile and tried to read her watch. 8:30, Jake said, dropping into a chair. "Food's ready when you are." "I should call home." "I already have. Your friend Shamika says things have quieted down, though she won't guarantee there's not someone still stuck in the chimney." Leah relaxed back on the sofa and reached for the wine. "I probably shouldn't on an empty stomach. 1 glass of this and I might be tap dancing on your 18th century French credenza." "Ah, a fellow antiques enthusiast. I learned a great deal from my mother. On summer breaks she would take me to New Orleans to visit her parents and we'd scour the antiques shops looking for certain collector's pieces." She sipped the chilled wine, then grinned. "You don't strike me as a man who gets his thrills from stumbling over bargains in musty old antique shops." "My parents owned an antiques shop. My summers were spent abroad, mostly in England, going from estate sale to estate sale buying up antiques and bringing them back to sell in the States. It's how I got into veterinary medicine, as a matter of fact. Our summer home was right down the road from a racetrack. While my folks were bargaining for deals, I was tagging along behind the track vet, driving him crazy with questions." She studied her surroundings. "Nice apartment. I take it you haven't been here long." "A year." Leah raised her eyebrows and glanced again at the blank walls. Jake laughed. "Okay, I admit to a certain hesitance over hanging pictures and cluttering furniture with dust catchers. All that shouts too much of permanence. As my ex-wife will attest, I'm not a permanent kind of guy. Must be the gypsy in me. Stay in one place too long and I get itchy feet. I suppose you could pass as a gypsy. Tie a bandana around your brow and wear a large hoop earring in your left ear. Been there and done it already on the Harley I bought after the wife decided I was too mercurial in my moods. I think she called it my midlife crisis. Was it? I think it was more the old I don't think I love you anymore, so I'm going to act like a child and make you run, not walk, to the nearest divorce lawyer." He shrugged. It was civil. No kids involved, so that helped. "Regrets?" "No." He shook his head and finished his wine. "I didn't love her anymore, so how could there be regrets?" "Ready for food?" "I'm starved." Leah smiled and Jake headed for the kitchen. The doorbell rang. Jake yelled, "You want to get that?" Leah set her wine aside and walked to the door. Johnny stood in the dark, hands in his jeans pockets. "Hi," he said simply, and stepped into the apartment. Jake stuck his head around the corner and grinned. "You're just in time for tofu and sprouts. Want wine or beer?" "Beer." Johnny bent and kissed Leah's mouth. "Hi," he repeated, giving her a wink. "I've been calling you all day. You and 50,000 other people." Catching her hand, he walked to the sofa and dropped onto it, pulling her down on his lap. "I finally called Jake myself and he told me you were here. We thought it best for you to stay until all the dust settled. I was just about to call Shamika. You won't get her." He kissed her again. "She and Val are at my place, making themselves at home by now I suspect, being waited on hand and foot. I get the feeling Shamika approves. Val thinks he's at a hotel. He keeps asking if they can get room service." Jake handed Johnny a beer, then picked up Leah's glass of wine and put it in her hand. "I think this calls for a celebration. To Johnny's good news, and to your impending marriage." Leah laughed and shook her head. Why am I getting the feeling that I'm missing some vital information here? What's your good news? Johnny drank deeply of his beer before answering. The DA announced that my blood tests were clean. And? What about the negligence issue? Jake retreated to the kitchen and Johnny considered his answer a long moment before replying. There are other aspects of the accident they're looking into, of course. He kissed her hand and looked hard into her eyes. The only thing that matters to me right now is you and Val, and our spending the rest of our lives together. Chapter 21. I know this sounds crazy, and a month ago if somebody had told me I'd be bored enough of being waited on hand and foot to tear out my hair I would have 1. Suggested they were on drugs. 2. Insisted they were out of their minds. And 3. Told them to their face that they were simply jealous and to get a life. Her hands on her hips as she watched one of Johnny's many housekeepers haul away Shamika's dirty laundry, Shamika shook her head. Is that all that woman ever does? Every time I change my underwear she snatches them up and washes them. I'm starting to get a complex. Shamika looked around at Leah where she lay across Val's massive bed, coloring within the black lines of the crayon book her son had been scribbling in the night before. If Professor Carlyle could just see you now, Shamika laughed. Leah tossed aside the red crayon and rolled to her back, sighed heavily, and shook her head. How did my mother do it? No wonder she couldn't get through the day without drinking. I can't believe I once looked at this indulgence as commonplace, something to be expected in life. Val seems to be enjoying it. Leah smiled. Val is enjoying Johnny. He thinks it's very awesome, his new word, not mine, to be driven to school by a chauffeur. Call it what it is, girlfriend. Bodyguard. Not a bad-looking one at that. I hear he played for the Broncos for a couple of seasons, until his back was injured. Divorced. 2 kids. 32 years old and makes nearly 50 grand a year. Leah laughed. So when are the two of you going out? Saturday night. Dinner at 7. I got my eye on a little red number with spaghetti straps and a neckline cut down to here. Shamika sat down beside Leah and stared at the wall. Seriously? Yes, let's be serious. I think it's wonderful what Johnny is doing for you and Val, and me too for that matter. But especially Val. I've never seen him happier. Every day is like Christmas. Johnny's there when Val eats his breakfast. Johnny makes sure he gets off to school on time. Johnny reads to him at night, and you're feeling as if you're not needed anymore. Shamika shrugged and grinned. I confess, I'm missing the little guy. She flopped back on the bed and the two of them stared at the ceiling. I don't know what it is about Johnny, but Val is thriving and that's all that matters. How about you, Leah? How are you doing with all this? I feel like Cinderella. So why are you still holding out on the marriage proposal? I married Richard for the wrong reasons: security, money, fear of surviving on my own. Probably all the reasons why most women get married. I don't think I ever really loved him. He was simply a means to an end. But you love Johnny. Yes. She smiled dreamily. So you've got your cake and can eat it too. But I can't give up me again. I worked hard to get through school, to become the finest vet I'm capable of being. Not simply to survive, but because I love doing it. I don't want to be like my mother, a fixture to take out and show off occasionally. I have to have a purpose. Spoken like a true modern woman. Shamika rolled from the bed. But from one modern woman to another, life is gonna suck real bad when you get to be 50 or 60 and you look up one day and find yourself alone. Think back over the last few years and your regret over having walked out on Johnny the first time, the love you felt like you missed out on. I failed once, Shamika. Get over it. Get over this fear you've got of having more children. Get over this hang-up you've developed over failure. Get over this absurd need for your father's approval. Now that is absurd. Is it? Shamika walked to the door. He's never going to change, Leah. He is what he is. Senator Foster is a machine. Cold, hard steel. So what if he offered you a job? You know as well as I do why he did it. To buy you over to his side. To woo you away from Johnny. To assure your loyalty when the caca hits the fan. Look at it this way, Cinderella. How many people in life actually get a second chance to recapture the greatest love of their life? As Shamika left the room, Leah got up and walked to the window. Below, men milled about the manicured grounds, most dressed casually in jeans and t-shirts, the telltale bulges of their hidden guns the only evidence that they were anything more than gardeners. Not that she wasn't accustomed to men lurking around their home with guns tucked under their belts. Since her father had won his seat in the Senate, weapon-toting companions had become the norm. Certainly, that had been half a lifetime ago. She'd been a teenager who thought it was cool to be driven to school by bodyguards. And this was now. She was an adult with a career. She thrived on fresh air and sunshine, her independence, and her privacy, of which she had become obsessive since Val's birth. How would she learn to deal with living their lives in a fishbowl, unable to curl up under her blanket of denial whenever life threw her a curve she did not want to acknowledge? But she also thrived on Johnny Whitehorse. Since he'd moved her into his house a week ago, she had never felt so alive or happy, or in love. At times she felt positively delirious, so why couldn't she shake this sense of impending doom, as if the sky would open up at any moment and rain catastrophe on her head? At 9:40 that night, Leah said goodnight to Roy Moon, patted the Arabian stallion she had ridden the last hour in the indoor arena, and headed for the house. Hopefully the meeting between Johnny and his staff would be ended. She wanted to talk to him again about her returning to work now that the media had backed off in the attempts to wrangle interviews and photos from them. Not that she was worried that she would lose her job. Johnny was one of the bosses, after all. In fact, the entire board of trustees had given their approval of her taking as much time as she needed for the media storm to subside, as they all knew it eventually would. Until the recent accident with Dolores, Johnny had managed to maintain his privacy in Ruidoso. To most of the locals he was simply Johnny, hometown boy made good. Had it not been for Dolores's death and the frantic scramble to cover it in the media, life would have remained relatively normal at Whitehorse Farm except for the occasional out-of-towners who cruised by in their rent-a-car to snap photos of Johnny's front gate. Ed, Roger, and Jack filed out of the house and streamed down the front steps, briefcases in hand, faces somber as they marched toward their cars. They barely glanced at Leah, as if intentionally ignoring her existence. Robert Anderson tarried on the porch, the light overhead casting sharp shadows on his face. "Everyone looks very serious," she commented as she mounted the front steps. Robert didn't smile. "It wasn't much of a meeting. My client's thoughts appear to be elsewhere." Val's laughter erupted from the house, bringing a smile to Leah's face. Anderson shook his head and with a muttered curse headed for his car. Watching him go, Leah yelled, "Robert, I take it you don't have kids?" "No," he shouted back. "I didn't think so," she replied, then said to herself, "Lucky kids." Johnny met her in the foyer, pushing Val in his wheelchair. Shamika followed, the ex-Bronco football player at her side. He peeled away from the others and said, "I'll bring the car up." "Are we going someplace?" Leah asked. "Johnny has surprise for Val," Val announced very clearly, looking up at Johnny and grinning. "Oh." She kissed Val on the cheek and smiled at Johnny. "Is it bigger than a bread box?" "Definitely," Johnny replied. "Bigger than a 21-inch television?" "Absolutely." "A 6-stack of hay bales?" "Much bigger." She feigned a frown and narrowed her eyes. Val's grin grew wider and Shamika shrugged as Leah glanced at her for a hint. "Is it on the premises?" she asked. "Nope," Johnny said. The ear stopped at the foot of the steps and Johnny eased Val's chair down each stair as the driver opened the car doors, then hurried over to help put Val in the backseat. "Am I invited?" Leah asked. Johnny turned and lifted his hand to her. "Would I go anywhere without you?" "I don't know. Would you?" "Not unless I felt it would be detrimental to your life and happiness." You are such a smooth talker, Johnny. And you love it. Oh yes. She took his hand. I most definitely love it. The lights of the Big Top Carnival and Circus lit up the night sky in a bloom of red, green, gold, and blue twinklers. The glowing marquee out front read, "Welcome Valentino Star." There was a scattering of cars and vans in the parking lot, each showing handicapped license plates. As the driver parked the limo among them, Leah looked at Johnny, then Shamika, who had begun to grin. What's going on? Johnny rented the carnival for tonight, for Val and his friends. Leah sank back in the seat, glad for the darkness that hid the look of raw emotion she was certain was etched in her face. She couldn't speak. She did not dare look at Johnny or she would burst out in tears. Johnny took her hand. I trust you remember this place. She nodded and swallowed. You brought me here on our first real date. I got a stomachache eating corn dogs and cotton candy. You won a giant walrus playing skee-ball. I still have it, by the way. And at closing time you got your friend who operated the Ferris wheel to stop us at the top so we could watch the fireworks exploding all around us. I think we ended up making out more than we watched the fireworks. We made our own fireworks. Johnny wiggled his eyebrows, making Shamika laugh and Leah blush. Both children and adults rode the rides, played the games, all of which had obviously been rigged to allow the children to win, ate cotton candy, popcorn, and ice cream, and watched the circus of trained elephants, tigers, and horses, not to mention the lithe trapeze artists flying through the air with the greatest of ease. Val rode the merry-go-round 12 times, Johnny and Leah at his side, coaxing him to hold fast to the rising and falling steed with arched neck and flaring nostrils. By the 8th ride he was gripping the pole with his own hands, his legs locked around the animal's body, whooping and laughing and shouting to Shamika, who waved each time they flew by her, Val flying now Mika. Just before midnight everyone climbed aboard the Ferris wheel. It slowly rotated high into the night sky, allowing them to look out over the grounds of bright, vibrant lights the color of rainbows. With Val sitting between her and Johnny, Leah held her son's hand and pointed to the distant glow of downtown Ruidoso. Then they counted the stars overhead and watched a meteorite streak across the universe in a burst of fiery light. At straight up midnight, the Ferris wheel stopped, leaving Leah, Johnny, and Val swinging at the very top. Then the first streaks of fireworks whirred into the sky above their heads and exploded, sending red and green sparks mushrooming to what seemed to be forever. Then more, popping, banging, inundating the night with light, until the shapes of words formed before Leah's eyes. Marry me smiling, laughing, acknowledging the applause and whistles of approval from Val's guests. Leah turned her tear-filled eyes to Johnny's and nodded. Of course I'll marry you. Of course. The phone rang at 3 a.m. Johnny fumbled for it, glancing at Leah to see if it had disturbed her. Johnny? Johnny, it's Savannah. Are you alone? He sat up, shook his head in an attempt to clear his mind of its grogginess, then leaned slightly over Leah to see if she was really asleep. Good as, he finally replied in a slightly slurred voice. What is that supposed to mean? Exactly what it sounds like. Leah is there, isn't she? So what? Tell me the rumors aren't true. Are you marrying her or not? What's that got to do with anything? Everything, considering what I'm holding in my hand. He glanced back at Leah and partially covered the phone with one hand. You got them. Those and more. Seems I'm not the only one who sneaks the occasional forbidden photo. There came a muffled voice, then a loud, hello? Johnny jerked the phone from his ear. Hello? Hello? I don't think there's anyone there. Hello? Mr. Whitehorse? Is that really you? Lowering his voice even more, Johnny whispered, who the hell is this? Maud Elliott, Mr. Whitehorse. This is really Mr. Whitehorse, isn't it? The guy on Fifth Avenue? The one with his jeans unzipped? He rolled his eyes and left the bed, tucked the phone under one arm and walked to the bathroom, closed the door, eased the lid down on the toilet and sat down in the dark. Hello? Is anyone there? Maud Elliott seemed to scream. Obviously, Savannah has a good reason for this, he finally replied, more to himself than to Maud Elliott. I'm a photographer, Mr. Whitehorse. I've worked for Formation Media for, oh, golly, 5 years or so. Well, I really don't work for FM. I'm freelance. I move around a lot. Sometimes the resorts contract me to, take pictures of their guests or do promotional shots for brochures or ads or postcards. I work mostly with the island resorts, Barbados, Aruba. What are you telling me, Ms. Elliott? Oh, please, call me Maud. He nodded and took a deep breath. I met Savannah last year when I came up to Toronto for the opening of the Crystal Casino. We sort of hit it off. She's a darn good photographer. Get to the point. Maud. Oh, sure. I guess you're wanting to get back to bed, huh? Heck, I'm used to these kind of hours, Maud. Oh. Ah. Savannah has filled me in with what's going on. You're trying to nail that senator. Good for you. They're all a lot of sleazebuckets, would sell their blind grannies if they thought it would buy them a few votes. Anyway, what she's got here, the photos, they're good, a little grainy, but what I've got are better. Johnny frowned. Are you saying you have photographs of Foster, Aruba, 3 years ago? You see, Formation never holds their meetings in the same place. For obvious reasons, they wish to keep their anonymity. Just so happens I was there doing a shoot for one of their competitors, the Hilton I think, or maybe it was Holiday Inn. I wandered over to the Rama Rio resort with the thought of knocking on a few doors, handing out a few business cards, drum up a little business. The place was swarming with bigwigs. I mean, these cats were dripping the dinero, know what I mean? Major big shots were talkin', and pretty damn creepy lookin' if you ask me. I thought I'd fallen into a friggin' United Nations powwow. Japanese, Mexicans, Middle Easterners. And right there among them was these familiar faces. Foster. Among others. Ever heard of Gary Taylor? Elected governor of Nevada the last election. Bingo. How about Mark Schwinn? Minnesota senator. And last but not least, Harry Johnston. Just announced his intentions of running for governor of New Jersey the next election. Johnny closed his eyes. Jesus. You have their photographs? Not with me, of course. They're in my files. Shoot, at the time it just never occurred to me that there was any kind of shenanigans going on. I just happen to collect photos of the rich and famous. Occasionally I can make a buck or two on them if the right opportunity comes along. Where are your files, Maud? Home. Where is home? He said through his teeth. The Caymans. Put Savannah on the phone, please. Savannah got back on the phone. Is she a nut or what? Johnny asked. Not at all. Where are you now? Atlanta. On my way to the Caymans. Once you get your hands on those photographs, stay put. I'm flying down to get you myself. What about Leah, Johnny? What do you intend to do about her? I don't know, he said in the dark. When Leah awoke, she reached for Johnny. He wasn't there. She sighed and closed her eyes, smiling as she thought of the night before, of fireworks and falling stars, and the happiness in her son's face. It was a dream. A wonderful, beautiful dream. Too romantic to be real. Too miraculous to be believable. The door opened and Shamika, grinning ear to ear, walked in pushing a wheelchair. Leah sat up and rubbed her eyes. Well? What do you think? Shamika parked the chair by the bed. It arrived this morning. Top of the line, honey. This baby is good for 100,000 miles at least. And get a load of this. She dropped into it and touched a button. The chair moved forward. She touched another and it rolled back. Leah slid from the bed and moved slowly around the chair, her throat beginning to hurt. Am I really seeing what I think I'm seeing? This sweetheart must have put Johnny Boy back a good 12 grand. And not only that. I just got a call from a Jolene Carrington at Albuquerque Medical Research Institute. She spoke to Johnny 3 days ago. He's arranged for us to take Val in to be evaluated for Botox treatments. If he's considered a good candidate, they can begin the treatments immediately. Like that day. Leah pulled off her nightgown and grabbed for a t-shirt, then her jeans. She began to laugh so hard she stumbled around with one leg in her pants, the other out. A maid appeared at the door, and Shamika, laughing too, cried, "Hold on to your drawers, Leah, the panty snatcher is back." Grabbing up the panties Johnny had pulled off her the night before, Leah tossed them to the wide-eyed servant. "You may have my panties. You may have all of my panties. I may never wear panties again, for that matter." At last she wiggled the jeans up over her naked hips and snapped them. "Where is Johnny?" Barefoot, she ran from the room. "Haven't seen him this morning," Shamika yelled after her. She took the stairs two at a time, barely managing to contain her outrageous desire to slide like a mischievous kid down the winding banister. On tiptoe she moved to the office door, which was slightly ajar. Hearing someone speaking quietly, she nudged the door open. Edwin Fullerman sat behind Johnny's desk, his back to Leah as he spoke on the phone. "Look, Ted. We are not prepared at this time to go on record with any public accusations. What good would it do either of us? Until we have proof positive in our hands, we keep our mouths closed. All I can tell you now is that Johnny is on his way to some undisclosed location to pick up the evidence to nail that son of a bitch. I can appreciate your position. District Attorney Singer has been more than patient. You know and I know Johnny didn't drive himself off that road and intentionally kill Dolores Rainwater. He was purposefully rammed off that road by another car. Your forensics experts have verified that beyond a shadow of a doubt. But until we've established a motive, exactly, we'll be faced with another scandal that will end up hurting a lot of people and damaging Johnny's reputation." Ed tapped on the desk with the end of a pencil as he nodded and sighed into the phone. "I've attempted to call Robert Anderson this morning. No luck so far. But I'm sure Johnny will want you to discuss your plans to publicly make a statement regarding the accident and the investigation with Bobby before you go on the air. Yes, I realize both the DA's office and the police are getting a lot of heat over this. It looks as if you're protecting Johnny. What? You can tell Singer to kiss our ass. No way is Johnny going to turn himself in to the frigging police for questioning. I don't care if this makes the police and DA's office look like a bunch of dunces. Fine. Make your goddamn statement. Someone ran Johnny and Dolores off the road that night in an obvious attempt to kill them. The police are investigating the evidence. At this time, Johnny makes no further comment on the matter." Ed slammed the phone down and swung around in the chair. His eyes widened to find Leah standing in the door. "Oops," he said, and dropped the pencil to the desk. "What's going on?" Leah asked, her stomach feeling queasy all of a sudden. "What are you saying? That someone attempted to murder Johnny and Dolores?" He rocked back and forth in the chair and drummed his fingers on the desk. "Yes," he replied carefully. "Why wasn't I told about this? Johnny didn't want to overly alarm you." She walked slowly toward the desk, her eyes locked on Ed's. "Why are the police keeping so hush-hush about it? You know, the press and the wild public speculation. The last thing we want to do is throw open a can of worms." "Then you have an idea who's behind it?" Ed looked away. "Nothing definite. You just told Ted Weir that Johnny is off someplace gathering evidence. Obviously you think you know who did it." Mouth pressed, Ed considered his words. "First and foremost, Ms. Starr, we must protect Johnny. It's our job. He didn't get to where he is by dumb luck. He never made a move in his career that wasn't orchestrated beforehand. He's methodical and goal-oriented. He's surrounded himself with people as brilliant and motivated as he is. You know as well as I do that Johnny has no intention of spending his life in front of a camera. He has far greater aspirations, not to mention brains. You're not answering my question, Ed. Who would want to murder Johnny and Dolores? Someone who considers Johnny a threat, I suppose." She stared at Ed and watched as a red flush crept up his face, making his green eyes look greener behind their wire-rimmed spectacles. The sick feeling in her stomach spread through her body like icy tentacles as she backed to the door. "You bastards," she said, shaking her head. "You're going to accuse my father of this, aren't you? I think you'd better talk to Johnny. My father might be a machine, but he's not a monster. He's not a murderer." Leah turned for the door. Edwin jumped from his chair. "Leah, wait, go to hell," she shouted. "All of you." Savannah finished spreading the collection of photographs out over the table as Johnny leaned over her shoulder, inspecting each picture. There were images of seabirds and waves crashing against craggy shores, sunbathers frolicking in the surf, smiling seaside waiters serving guests icy drinks. There were others of plush hotels with brass ceiling fans, cool marble floors, and lush tropical trees growing in the foyers, and restaurant shots of buffet tables laden with passion fruits, mangoes, and papayas. But it was the last dozen photos that Savannah laid down that grabbed his attention. Maud Elliott picked up one of the 3x5s and waved it at him. "Got this with a telephoto lens. That sweetheart could define a nose hair at half a mile." Johnny took it and walked to a light. Maud chuckled and elbowed Savannah. "He's damn pretty, ain't he? If I wasn't 65 and gray-headed, I might put a move or two on him. Always did like the tall, dark, surly kind." Savannah smiled and reached for a photograph. "He don't say much, does he? He's simply very careful with his words. Guess he'd have to be, being who he is and all." She reached for the vodka and 7 she had put down earlier. "Sure you two don't want a drink? By the looks of those clouds, I suspect you're going to be here a while. Storms predicted for all night. I'd think real hard about taking that Cessna up in these winds. You guys care for a sandwich? I've got goose liver and pimiento cheese. Don't know about you, but I'm starving." Maud moved to the kitchen as Johnny shifted through the many photographs of well-suited businessmen, among them the familiar faces belonging to Foster, Taylor, Harry Johnston, and Schwinn. "It's the same group that came to Toronto last fall," Savannah said. They blocked off an entire wing of the hotel to assure their privacy from the guests. Johnny took other photographs and studied them as intently, then joined Maud in the kitchen. "You do all your own developing?" he asked. "Sure do. Can you enlarge this photograph to bring out these faces a little more clearly?" He pointed to the slightly blurred image of a man standing behind Senator Foster. "Sure. No problem." Putting aside her sandwich, Maud headed for the darkroom. Johnny walked to the plate-glass door and looked out on the distant horizon, where the gray rain clouds met the wind-whipped ocean. Maud was right. No way was he taking his plane through those clouds. "I expected more enthusiasm." Savannah moved up beside him. "It's Leah, isn't it? You know this will destroy her. More important, it will undoubtedly destroy the two of you. She'll see reason. She has to." Savannah laid her hand on Johnny's arm. "For your sake, I hope you're right." "Me? The bastard killed my sister. I'm going to make sure he goes to prison for the rest of his life." "Maybe." Frowning, Savannah shook her head in confusion. "Maybe? Are you telling me that you question whether Foster was behind the attempt to kill you and Dolores?" Johnny turned away. "I think I'll have that sandwich now." Savannah paced as Johnny stood at the glass door, ate his goose liver sandwich and watched the rain slam against the coast. Lightning danced above the waves and thunder vibrated the walls of the condominium. Finally, Maud emerged wearing an apron and rubber gloves. She handed the still damp photograph to Johnny. He moved to the lamp and turned the 8x10 into the light. "Aw God," he groaned. "That son of a bitch." Chapter 22. "Johnny's in Albuquerque," Shamika explained. "He asks that you not come to any rash decisions. He'll explain everything to you when he gets home. Did you tell him what I told you to tell him? Shall I repeat it for you in case you forgot?" Leah replied, her attention fixed on the hotel lobby's front entrance as she gripped the phone receiver to her ear. "Honey, I don't use language like that in mixed company." The lobby doors opened and a group of laughing tourists entered, their hair and clothes dripping water. Behind them, rain streaked like knives against the pavement. I take it you've not seen your father yet. I've been waiting since 11. No one seems to know when he'll return, or where he is for that matter. If he's smart, he's gotten the heck out of Dodge before the you-know-what hits the fan. You know as well as I that my father backs down from nothing. Neither does Godzilla. If something or someone gets in his way, he just stomps the bejesus out of it. In fact, that's probably where he is now, preparing to launch a full-scale attack against Johnny. Your office phone is ringing again. Shall I answer it? No. She glanced at the elevator, the front doors, the entrance to the coffee shop. I know you don't want to hear this now, but I got another call from the school. Sandra Howard is extremely concerned over Val. Leah, he's not taking this situation well. He's confused and showing signs of his old depression. He keeps asking for Johnny. He'll get over it. There was life before Johnny Whitehorse, apparently not for Val, and if you'll be honest with yourself for once, not for you either. Leah looked at her watch. Sandra Howard would be loading up the kids into the bus about now. The trip from the school to home normally took 30 minutes, but in this rain would take longer. If she left now, she would make it home in time for Val's arrival. Shamika sighed. Why, exactly, are you trying to see your father, Leah? What will it accomplish? Do you think by looking him in the eye and asking if he was in any way involved with Rainwater's death, you're going to determine if he's lying or not? Where have you been for 30 years? The man is a United States Senator, for God's sake. They invented the lie. In fact, I think I read someplace that the serpent in the Garden of Eden went on to become the first elected politician. The lobby door opened again and a man entered, his attention focused on the umbrella he was struggling to close. Leah, are you there? Shamika said in her ear. Yes. She nodded. I have to go now. I want to be home when Val gets there. That's the first sensible thing you've said today. Leah hit the end key on the mobile phone, then the power button, her gaze still locked on the man who finally turned toward her, mopping his damp face with a handkerchief. He looked directly at her and froze. Hello, Robert. Leah tucked the phone into her pocket and moved across the lobby. I thought you were staying at the Inn of the Mountain Gods. Right. He nodded and folded the handkerchief. Just here on business. And you? I came to see my father. His eyebrows raised and he glanced toward the elevator. I didn't realize the senator was in town. He tapped the end of his umbrella on the floor to dislodge the remaining rain. What's Johnny up to these days? Leah frowned. Haven't been by the ranch in the last couple of days? I spoke with Ed and Jack a couple of times. Ed tells me that you and Johnny have been holed up like lovebirds making plans for your marriage. So you haven't spoken with Johnny personally? Can't seem to get through to him. He gave her a thin smile. You can't keep him all to yourself, you know. The man's got responsibilities. Tell him to give me a call. We have issues to discuss. I'll bet. They stared at one another a silent moment, then Leah looked away. I have to go. Val will be on his way home. Good seeing you again. Oh, and drive safely. We wouldn't want another of Johnny's girlfriends to end up like Dolores, would we? Why do I get the impression you would like nothing better, Mr. Anderson? Turning her back on Anderson, Leah exited the hotel, glancing back briefly before running through the rain to her truck. With water running down her cheeks, she stared out through the rain-spattered window, watching as Anderson left the hotel and headed for his rented car. Odd that Anderson would know nothing about Johnny's being out of town, or the fact that she, Shamika, and Val had moved out of the ranch and back home 2 days ago. Why hadn't Ed informed him that Johnny was after evidence to prove her father was somehow involved with Dolores's death? Johnny never made a move or a statement without first consulting the consequences with Anderson. The truck shimmied, coughed, sputtered, and died 3 times before the engine finally turned over. The wipers scratched across the windshield, doing little to alleviate the torrent washing down over the truck. Leah drove as slowly as possible through the downtown traffic, revving the engine to keep it from dying when she was forced to stop at red lights. She turned on the radio just as the news came on, then turned it off. She wasn't in the mood to listen to more discussion about Johnny and her father and the investigation of Formation Media and Dolores's death, or the speculation on whether or not she, the senator's daughter, would marry Johnny Whitehorse. Turning on to Highway 249, she left the heavy traffic behind her. The rain, however, fell harder, forcing her to a crawl as she did her best to make out the broken yellow lines on one side, the shoulder of the road on the other. Cars moved up behind her and, growing impatient, whipped around her regardless of the slippery highway and the fact that visibility was virtually nil, their tires sending water spraying in a blinding curtain over her windshield. Again, a car moved up behind her, close, its bright lights like two staring eyes in the thick gray rain. It did not move around her, just inched closer, until it seemed to Leah to be inches from her bumper. If she was forced to brake suddenly, especially in this rain, no way would the driver avoid rear-ending her. Carefully, she eased over to the shoulder, allowing him room to pass. The car crept by her, its driver waving his thanks before speeding off into the haze. Tense, her hands gripping the steering wheel almost painfully, Leah did her best to breathe evenly as she moved back onto the road, dropping her speed even more as she came to a bend in the highway. Through the deluge came a flash of colored lights. The cars that had passed her moments before were braking and pulling off the highway as police in rain slickers waved them aside to allow one of the many emergency vehicles through. Sirens screaming and beacons blinking red and yellow lights, first one ambulance streaked by Leah, then another, on their way to Ruidoso Hospital. From her position she could just make out the jackknifed cab and trailer of an 18-wheeler that had obviously failed in its attempt to avoid hitting another vehicle. Leah turned off the engine and jumped from the truck, catching her breath as the rain speared into her face like little needles. She ran along the highway shoulder, shielding her eyes with one hand, nudging her way through the onlookers in hopes of offering her medical expertise in any way possible. A cop shouted at her and she yelled back, "I have a medical background. Perhaps I can help." Behind the policeman emerged the accident, the smashed truck cab pinning a vehicle to the ground. Blinking rain from her eyes, Leah moved toward the scene, glass shards crunching under her feet, the squawk of walkie-talkies and the shouts of paramedics assaulting her ears. Sirens shrieked as another ambulance eased through the growing crowd and headed for town. "No, no," she said aloud, shaking her head as her heart crawled out of her chest and up her throat, each beat as deafening as the thunder crashing overhead. A pressure centered behind her eyes, and she could not blink, or breathe, or move as she focused on the crushed and twisted remains of a school bus. "That's my son's bus," she choked, pointing to the crumpled mass and turning to the officer who walked toward her through the rain. "That's... Oh, God. Oh my God." Ed stood by his car near the runway as Johnny and Savannah walked away from the Cessna. "You both look like hell," Ed remarked as Johnny opened the passenger door. "That good, huh?" Johnny dropped into the front seat as Savannah crawled into the back. She lay down on the seat with a groan. "Don't anyone wake me until this time tomorrow," Savannah said as she closed her eyes. "So are either of you going to let me in on where you've been and what you were doing? Mind telling me why I've had to make up excuses why you could not or would not take or return phone calls? All hell has broken loose while you've been off gallivanting around the country." Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a candy bar. He glanced back at Savannah, who appeared to be sleeping already, then ripped open the Butterfinger and began to eat. "I haven't eaten since yesterday at noon." "Stop at the first drive-through you come to," Johnny replied. Ed rolled his eyes. "The senator has publicly challenged you, Johnny. He went on the 6 o'clock news last night and confronted you, the district attorney's office, and the police department to put up or shut up. Why, you ask? Because the word has finally come down from Washington. An investigation of the good senator and Formation Media is being launched. The district attorney finally admitted too that they believe the senator and Formation Media might have links to the accident that killed Dolores. Why? The media asked. Because, according to Johnny Whitehorse, at the time of Dolores's death she had evidence of Foster's affiliation with Formation Media, thereby establishing motive for the senator and/or Formation to kill you both. What about Leah? How is she taking it? Ed eased his foot off the gas and looked at Johnny, his normally ruddy complexion drained of color. Oh man. I forgot. You don't know. There was an accident yesterday. I would have called you but I didn't know how to reach you. I thought you might have heard about it on the news or something. What accident? Johnny crushed the butterfinger in his hand as he stared at Ed, waiting. Val's bus was hit by a truck yesterday afternoon during a storm. 5 were killed, Johnny, the driver, Sandra Howard, and 3 kids. The driver lived long enough to tell authorities that the brakes went out on the bus and he couldn't stop. They ran through a stop sign, directly in front of an 18-wheeler. No way could the truck's driver avoid hitting them. Val is critical, Johnny. According to Shamika, the doctors don't offer much hope. A slender blonde man with a deep tan stood outside Val's hospital room door, smoking a cigarette and staring at his feet. He looked up and frowned at Johnny as Johnny moved by him, headed for Val's room. The man grabbed Johnny's arm. Hey buddy, where the hell do you think you're going? Once Johnny had believed Val to have his mother's eyes, but looking down into Richard Starr's eyes, he realized he had been wrong. He bit back his urge to wrap his hands around Val's father's throat and crush it, not just because he had abandoned Leah and Val, but because he'd married Leah in the first place. Nobody goes in there except family, Starr said. Johnny jerked his arm away and turned for the door. Richard grabbed him again. I know who you are, Whitehorse. You might muscle your way around Hollywood or Washington, but not here. You're going to leave my kid and my wife alone. Ex-wife. My kid, Johnny replied with a short laugh, put his hand on Richard's chest, and shoved him against the wall. He then pointed his finger in Starr's face. Be nice. Be very nice, Dickie, or I'm liable to do something I'll later regret. I'm in a particularly sore mood right now, and anyone who has known me for any length of time knows my patience has its endurance. Backed into a corner, I come out swinging. Are you threatening me, Whitehorse? Definitely. I'll get the cops. You do that. Twisting his fingers in Richard's shirt, Johnny pushed him toward a nurse and orderly, who caught him before he fell on his face. The pair stared at Johnny as if a unicorn had suddenly materialized before them. Johnny eased open the door. Leah sat at Val's bedside, her head resting on the bed, eyes closed, her hand holding her son's as the monitors beeped frighteningly weakly in the quiet. Johnny sank against the wall, unable to speak. First Dolores. Now this. But this was worse, so much worse. This was a child. A very special child. Who might have, if things had gone differently those years ago, been his and Leah's. A young soul, a broken spirit that ached to fly. Johnny had wanted so desperately to teach him how. Leah opened her swollen red eyes and raised her head slowly. For the briefest instant a look of desperate relief wiped the lines from her brow, and her lips trembled. Then, just as swiftly, it was gone, replaced by an outrage that hit Johnny with a sickening punch. Get out, her lips whispered. Please, how dare you? Don't do this, Leah. If you don't leave this minute, I have to see him. Haven't you done enough? You've destroyed my father and, thanks to your subterfuge regarding your feelings for us, you've broken Val's heart. If you don't leave here now, I'm calling the police. I'll file charges on you for harassment. I love you. I love Val. Looking as if she might crumble into 1,000 pieces, Leah sagged against the bed. I so wanted it to be true. That you loved us. I can't tell you how often I fantasized of our finding one another again, of your coming to love my son like I do. I think, if I really want to be honest with myself for a change, that my real reason for returning to Ruidoso was in hopes of your forgiving me for my stupidity years ago. How infantile to believe you would come to care for us more than you care to remedy an injustice perpetrated against your people. Very selfish on my part to think you would give up half a lifetime of struggle for love. Johnny Whitehorse never turned his back on a fight. He always saw his obligations through. Funny. One of the very attributes that made me fall in love with you in the first place is the same one that breaks my heart now. Johnny shoved away from the wall. This time as he moved toward the bed, Leah did not stop him. Johnny touched Val's cold brow. "Hey, pal. It's Johnny. I've brought you something." Reaching into his shirt pocket, he withdrew the small trinket that had been carved into the shape of a human form. "It's called a TZI doll tie. A very long time ago I made it for your mother. I never got around to giving it to her. The TZI doll tie is carved of wood that has been struck by lightning, and therefore considered powerful and with much energy to ward off evil and illness. My grandfather gave me this wood when I was your age. Now I give it to you." He laid the talisman on Val's chest over his heart. Turning again to Leah, he did his best to smile as he touched her face. "Sons Ray. My morning star. I told you once that I would not lose you again. I meant it." Pressing a kiss to her brow, Johnny held Leah briefly before turning for the door. Richard Starr stood with Shamika in the waiting area outside Val's room. Shamika hurried over to Johnny and threw her arms around him. He hugged her close as she wept against his shoulder. "Where is her father?" Johnny asked. "With his attorneys," she replied, wiping her face with a tissue. "Would you believe he hasn't even been up here yet? Sent word last night that as soon as his meetings were over he'd come up. Call me if anything changes. I'll be at the ranch." She nodded as Johnny walked over to Richard, who ground out his cigarette in an ashtray. "You and I will meet again," Johnny told him, the tone of his voice enough threat that Richard looked nervously toward the nearest exit. Searching his pocket for coins, Johnny moved to a payphone on the wall. He punched in the ranch number and waited as the phone rang. Ed answered. "Is the meeting arranged?" Johnny asked. 1 hour from now. Did you reach Inspector Parker?" "Everything's arranged. How's Val?" "He's going to be fine," Johnny replied in as strong and positive a voice as he could manage. Then he added, "But I'm not so sure about his mother." Savannah paced as Roy Moon, Ed, Jack, and Johnny drank their hot coffee in silence. Inspector Parker, District Attorney Singer, and Ted Weir chatted quietly in the corner of the office, laughing occasionally, as if arresting someone on suspicion of murder and attempted murder was nothing out of the ordinary. The door opened suddenly and Robert walked in. "Sorry I'm late. I was on an overseas call when I got your message." He stopped short upon seeing Parker, Singer and Weir. "This looks serious." "Very," Johnny said. "Sit down, Bobby." Robert cleared his throat and sat down, placed his briefcase beside his feet, and took a deep breath. "Should I get my recorder for this?" Johnny shrugged. "Why not?" Robert dug into the briefcase for the recorder, his gaze moving over the law officials in the back of the room. "I hope you haven't discussed anything with them that might prejudice your rights." "Wouldn't think of it, Bobby. You've taught me better than that." Johnny grinned as Robert hit the on button, then sat back in the chair. "So what's up?" Robert asked. Savannah moved up behind Johnny. "I work for the Crystal Casino in Toronto. I'm Dolores's sister." "Really? My condolences to your family." He crossed his legs and looked from Savannah back to Johnny, then to Ed and Jack. "Where were you the night of my accident?" Johnny asked. "That's a very odd question. Did you have a conversation with Dolores 2 days before her death?" He shrugged. "Maybe. You know Dolores. She was always calling me or Ed, asking our advice on one thing or another." "What was her reason for calling you that day?" "I don't recall. I'll tell you why she called you." Savannah moved around the desk. "To ask legal advice regarding evidence I supplied her of Senator Foster's association with Formation Media. She thought way too much of her career to jeopardize it in any way. Although she didn't mention you by name, she told me when we spoke on the phone that she intended to contact an attorney just to be on the safe side." Savannah sat on the desk before Robert, her knee touching his. "Aside from me, Johnny, and Dolores, you're the only other person who knew about those photographs, Mr. Anderson. Johnny opened the desk drawer and retrieved several papers. He handed them to Robert, remaining silent as Robert shifted through them, his brow beginning to sweat. Would you like to explain what you were doing in Albuquerque before my accident? Why you rented a car at the airport that afternoon and returned it early the next morning, apologizing for the fact that you were in a slight accident but the insurance you took out on the car would take care of it. After the accident, I phoned your home, Roy stated. It was around 1 o'clock here. I got your answering service and left a message that was urgent. You called me back an hour later and said that you would be on the first flight available. At 2 a.m., after turning in the car you used to run me and Dolores off the road, you went over to another rental company and hired another car. The one sitting in my driveway right now. You grabbed a few hours sleep at the Best Western near the airport, then you drove back to Ruidoso, arriving at the ranch around 7. Robert swallowed. You've been busy the last few days, Johnny. You taught me to make sure all my J's were dotted and my R's were crossed, Bobby. The district attorney stood up. The big question is, did you perpetrate this crime on your own? Averting his eyes, his lower lip starting to tremble, Robert shook his head. Neither Foster nor Formation were involved in this in any way. I acted totally on my own. Jesus, Johnny, I didn't mean for anybody to get killed. I just thought that if I scared her enough she'd think twice before pressing on with her investigation. I'd been working for Formation for several years. I knew if Dolores began uncovering too much, my association with them would come out and I'd fry right along with them. Who exactly is them? Ted Weir asked. Laughing dryly, Robert raised his eyebrows. Oh no. The only way you're going to get that kind of information out of me is going to be with a promise of witness protection. Singer picked up the tape recorder and hit the off button. He slid the machine into his pocket before turning to Johnny. I take it you got the evidence you needed on Senator Foster and Formation. Johnny looked past the DA, into Savannah's eyes. No, he replied. But you said, I lied. Silence filled up the room briefly, then Ted said, it won't end here, Johnny. Photographs or not. You realize that, don't you? At some point you're going to have to tell what you know to the committee. Johnny did not respond as Robert was escorted out of the office between Parker and Singer. Roy, Ed, and Jack followed, leaving Savannah and Johnny alone. She closed the door and leaned against it, her face aflame with color. You bastard, Johnny. What do you think you're doing? You're going to let Foster get away with it, aren't you? All because of her. Because of Leah and the boy. My God, I never believed you would turn your back on your people. We all must make choices in life, and you choose her. I can't destroy her. I would rather destroy myself. You're going to do just that, Johnny. You won't be able to live with the guilt. Every time you look in the face of one of our people's children you'll know unimaginable shame. No matter how deeply you love this woman, you are who you are, and what you are. That will never change. Johnny withdrew the envelope of photographs and tossed them across the desk. Fine, Savannah cried, grabbing up the package. I'll do it. For Dolores, do you think Dolores's intent to blow Foster and Formation to hell had anything to do with loyalty to our people? If you think that, then you are more naive than I thought. Dolores wanted a network job. She couldn't give a damn about the people. Savannah marched toward the door, yanked it open, then stopped, slowly turned, her eyes filled with tears. You know if I do this and Foster is destroyed, she will still blame you. Perhaps. You love her that much? She shook her head. Damn you, Johnny Whitehorse. Leah smiled into her son's drowsy eyes as the doctor in charge quietly relayed orders to the attending nurses. He then placed a comforting hand on Leah's shoulder. We're over the worst, I think. Shamika moved to the bed and took Val's hand. She held it to her cheek and did her best not to cry as Leah pressed a kiss to his brow. His lips curved into his familiar smile, and light flickered in his eyes. Johnny, he whispered. Johnny was here to see you this morning. He brought you a gift. She held up the amulet. He made it himself, just for you. Johnny still love Val? Oh, yes, my darling. He loves you very, very much. Val, Mama, and Mika go home with Johnny? Leah looked up at Shamika before responding. We'll see. First, you have to get well. His eyes drifted closed. Leah and Shamika continued to hold his hands as the doctor completed his chart, then set it aside. His condition has stabilized, Mrs. Starr. The best thing you could do right now is to go home and get some sleep. If there's any change, we'll call you. Shamika nodded. I'll stay with him. Leah took a weary breath and nodded. Maybe for a while. Upon leaving the room, Leah found Richard in the waiting area, asleep on a sofa. She had been angry with Shamika at first over contacting Richard's parents about Val, then thankful. Richard had arrived in a few hours, had donated blood just in case Val needed it. Thank God, he hadn't. Leah? She turned. Savannah Rainwater moved out of the shadows. I'm happy that your son has improved. I thought you left Ruidoso days ago. I did. But I had some unfinished business. Leah looked beyond her, scanned the hospital corridor. If it's Johnny you're looking for, he isn't here. I left him back at the ranch. I assume he's still there. If you came here to defend Johnny, I guess you haven't heard. Leah frowned, uncertain if she could handle any more bad news at the moment. Johnny has just cleared your father of my sister's death. Sinking back against the wall, Leah closed her eyes. That's where Johnny's been the last few days, gathering proof that Robert Anderson is the one who ran Johnny and Dolores off the road that night. You see, Robert is involved with Formation Media. Very much involved. Along with a number of senators and governors, all of whom are making it very easy for a great many very powerful men to control the gambling in this and other countries. Savannah reached into her purse and withdrew a package. She placed it in Leah's hands. Johnny gave these to me to do what I want with them. They're photos I and another photographer took at the Crystal Casino in Toronto and the Rama Rio Resort in Aruba. If I use those photographs. She looked away. Let's just say I've always considered Johnny Whitehorse a gift to our people, one, I'm sorry to say, who isn't appreciated by the people as he should be. Sometimes we stand so close to a good thing we can't see it distinctly enough to recognize its worth. I've known Johnny to love only one thing greater than the people, and that was you. Until today I simply didn't realize just how much he loves you, that he would sacrifice all that he believes in and has worked for to protect your heart. At this very moment your father is preparing to go on television to make a statement regarding the fact that he has been cleared of Dolores's murder, and the fact that Johnny has publicly stated that he will no longer pursue the senator's affiliation with Formation Media, that as far as he knows no evidence exists that could link your father to Formation. I feel sick when I think of what this will do to Johnny. His reputation, his political future, his pride. When at last he has found a voice to speak to the world against injustice, who will listen to him now? And believe him? Savannah turned and walked down the corridor. Leah opened the package and withdrew the photographs. Senator Foster adjusted his tie as a young man blotted his nose with powder and another smoothed down a few gray hairs on the top of his head. His speechwriter shoved several papers into his hands as a KRXR producer barked orders into a headset and nodded to Foster. Whenever you're ready, Senator. Foster stepped through the door, waving at the mob of reporters who filled the room with the harsh glare of video camera lights. He carefully moved over the tangle of electrical cords, gingerly mounted the dais, and stepped up to the mic. The cameras whirred and clicked. Foster posed, smiling, both hands raised, thumbs up as the din of reporters began to shout for his attention. He waited for the noise to subside, smiling, laughing, shrugging and mugging for the dozen cameras zooming in for a close-up of his face. "Senator, how are you feeling?" someone shouted. "Relieved. The accusations hurled at me by Whitehorse the last few years took their toll, of course. What about the Senate Investigative Committee?" Do you think they'll be satisfied with Whitehorse's statement that he doesn't plan to further pursue this case? I don't anticipate there being any problem with that. My attorneys are with them now. What about your plans regarding Whitehorse? You stated previously that you intended to bring a civil case against him for slander. I fully intend to do just that. What that man has put me and my family through the last few years is unspeakable. Senator, any truth to the rumor that you will now make a bid for the presidency? Before the senator responds to that question, Leah said as she stood up, perhaps he would like to explain what business would take him to the Crystal Casino in Toronto as well as the Rama Rio Casino in Aruba, both owned by Formation Media, both times corresponding with meetings of the very powerful and questionable Formation Consortium. The room fell silent as Leah moved from her chair and toward the dais where her father stared down at her, squinting from the lights, his jaw working and his face turning red. He glanced at the cameras and the reporters and cleared his throat. Leah? What the hell are you doing? I asked you a question, Senator. Will you stand there and deny you were ever at those casinos? I might have visited them. Hey, even senators are allowed to have a little fun now and again. He laughed into the mic, his eyes narrowing as Leah stepped up onto the dais beside him and laid down the photographs. She covered the mic with her hand and looked into his eyes. I was wrong, Senator. You are a monster. I'm just sorry it's taken me so damn long to admit it. Leah turned her back on her father and jumped from the dais. The room full of shocked reporters came alive, swarming over one another in an effort to thrust their microphones at her face. I have no comment regarding my father's crimes or his impending resignation. The evidence in my possession will be turned over to the proper authorities as soon as I leave here. You may discuss the issue with them. Ms. Starr, what about the rumor that you intend to marry Johnny Whitehorse? True, she replied, smiling.